V redu. Ura je minuta čez eno, tako da mislim, da lahko začnemo. Dober dan in dobrodošli. Moje ime je Nataša Kramar in v imenu NAKVIS-a bom pričela z letošnjim mednarodnim posvetom na temo mikrodokazil. Ker gre za mednarodni dogodek, bom nadaljevala v angleščini, imate pa vsi v Zoomu možnost izbire poslušanja v slovenščini. Se pravi, v rodni vrstici izberete opcijo Interpretation in si tam nastavite zaželen jezik. Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Nataša Kramar and on behalf of the SQAA Quality Assurance Agency, I would like to invite you all to our international conference on designing a QA model for microcredentials. The first part of the conference will be in English and the second part will be in Slovene. You can choose the preferred language with the button Interpretation. Regarding potential questions, a special QA session after the presentation is not planned. However, you can ask questions during the panel discussion in the Zoom QA chat. Now, without further ado, I invite our director, Franci Demšar, to give an official welcome.
Dobar dan, good afternoon, colleagues and guests. I'm pleased to welcome you to our traditional conference on quality in higher education. These past couple of years, our conferences covered hybrid education, online quality assurance, European universities, and this year we return with another very relevant topic of microcredentials. Every international conference published proceedings, including this one, which will appear in the beginning of the next year. I'm, of course, thankful that we're joined by a diverse group of speakers and participants, including distinguished speakers from home and abroad, the representatives of OECD, SQAA, foreign and domestic universities, the Ministry for Higher Education, Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and Slovenian Student Union. I also kindly welcome all the attendees, our experts, representatives of higher education institutions, and all our national and international partners who have joined us today in great numbers. Since microcredentials are currently a topic of great interest in the Slovenian and European higher education area, we felt it is necessary to cover the topic in our conference while focusing on the designing of a suitable quality assurance model for microcredentials. As we navigate this evolving terrain, it is crucial to balance innovation with a commitment to quality. Under the project guided by our ministry, our public universities have already started introducing microcredentials in the Slovenian higher education area. So it is of great importance for the external quality assurance system that our agency provides to follow suit. This conference presents a valuable opportunity for us to exchange ideas, confront challenges, and share best practices. I encourage open and constructive dialogue, as the insight we gain be instrumental in guiding our path forward. Thank you all for your participation and knowledge you bring to our gathering.
Thank you for the welcome. Now I will invite our first speakers, Shizuka Kato and Rosa Giorfi from the OECD, who will present key findings from their study. Rosa and Kato, please go ahead.
Okay. Dobry dan. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. So my name is Rosa Giorfi and I'll be joined today by my colleague Shizuka Kato.
Hello.
We are working in the OECD's higher education policy team. We have been working on microcredentials for some time now, and this year we've been working on a microcredential implementation project which was co-financed by the European Union. And in this project, notably, we worked with the Slovenian Ministry of Higher Education, Science and Innovation, and 3 other European member states. And in this presentation, we'll just briefly outline our main findings from this project. So Microcredentials in general, we can see that interest in microcredentials is on a steady rise. This can be seen in the Google searches into this term, and probably for the audience, more notably in the presence of microcredentials in national and European policy discussions and a number of reports into this subject in recent years. But what exactly are microcredentials? So, how do microcredentials differ? Microcredentials are, in general, smaller study programs that are more targeted on specific groups, such as adults already at work or those trying to reorientate their careers. They are also supposed to be more flexible in terms of delivery, so they make use of digital education tools. And there is a question of why are we interested in them, and for what purposes are they taken? Up until now, what we've seen is that
sedaj je razlog za mikrodokazila
either kind of a personal desire for continuing education, returning into education, more commonly to improve one's career perspectives or prospects. And there is also a large group of learners who take microcredentials because of a kind of personal interest. Sorry. Can you see the next slide? Yes. Okay. So in terms of from kind of policy or societal perspective, microcredentials are expected to be used for a variety of purposes depending on national and social context. So some governments are looking to use them more for reskilling and upskilling, others to encourage international mobility, others to strengthen citizenship. This varies, as I said, from one country to another. But the most common is usually upskilling and reskilling. And how are these microcredentials different from existing shorter learning credentials that are very often offered in higher education institutions? Some of the kind of key features can be that they tend to be more closely labor market oriented. So the idea is that they look at medium to long-term skills needs in the broader kind of socioeconomic environment. They tend to make use of online learning channels. Very often they are fully online. Many institutions are looking, or many institutions and countries are looking to explore making them stackable, so allow them to be taken as individual qualifications, but also create the possibility of combining them towards larger qualifications. And most importantly, they are very often created not just within one part of the education system, so not just higher education institutions, but kind of in collaboration between higher education institutions, best provision, and labor market actors. And so how are microcredentials being developed up until now? How have they been developed? Generally, we can differentiate between two types, largely. One is kind of the individual initiatives of higher education institutions, and another would be kind of the very broad range of initiatives taken by higher education institutions in collaboration with other actors, be that labor market actors, or through online learning platforms, or through national and international collaboration projects. Just looking briefly at the initiatives taken by higher education institutions independently, these can involve creating new programs, but more typically, they involve using their existing provision, either degree provision or non-degree courses, to kind of offer new education in a new form. So examples of that could be unbundling degree programs. This is when an institution would take courses or modules of existing study programs and offer them as standalone qualifications. Another example is what we call bundling of courses. This involves taking individual courses and modules or courses and modules offered as non-degree education and combining them into a thematic and targeted program. And yet another example is when institutions already have a well-developed non-degree provision, and they use microcredential, kind of create microcredentials based on that provision. In some cases, we even see that institutions are already, like higher education institutions are already creating microcredentials in collaboration with labor market actors. On the side of the collaborative microcredentials, this is a bit difficult to difficult to have a very neat typology here, but all in all, we see that there are examples of these can involve different initiatives. Very often these categories overlap a bit. So if we look at, for example, learning platforms, online learning platforms, we see that there are private ones like Coursera. There are fully public or even government initiated ones, such as SQAA in India, which was established in 2017 by the Ministry of Education. Then we have examples of initiatives which are kind of government programs in which higher education institutions or education institutions, in this particular case in Canada, post-secondary education institutions were given the opportunity to participate in funding rounds where they co-created programs directly with employers. Then we have, yes. Yeah. Then we have learning platforms that are created directly by higher education institutions or other non-profit consortia. An example of this would be Future Learn, and on these platforms we see examples of higher education institutions offering programs again in collaboration with labor market actors such as companies. This particular example is a collaboration on Future Learn by a French higher education institution, the Institut Français de la Mode, and the French kind of multinational company Kering. Then moving on, we have the examples of the international initiatives between different higher education institutions, most notably the European Universities Alliance, which is an initiative to currently comprise of 50 multinational university alliances, in which institutions from 35 European and European partner countries are in this initiative, and these initiatives, many of these initiatives are involved in creating microcredential programs. An example of this would be Civis, who created microcredential programs aimed at fostering interdisciplinary kind of thinking on a variety of societal questions. And then another type of kind of collaboration between higher education institutions would be the fairly well-known microcredit initiative from Ireland. This is a initiative of the Irish Universities Association and 7 Irish higher education institutions, which is funded through an employer levy. And this is a 5-year project in which the participants created a kind of shared format, an understanding of microcredentials, as well as a common platform on which the microcredentials will be presented. And so what has the OECD been doing on microcredentials? The OECD has been working on us, the higher education policy team, have been working on microcredentials for the last 5 years. We've published several papers starting in 2019, and in our current project, we just published a paper summarizing the known kind of information base on the uses of microcredentials, and we have 2 new publications coming up in the next few weeks. And the microcredential implementation project that we are working on is a project that has been running until the end of the year. It had kind of 2 focuses. Firstly, it looked at examining the evidence base on the field of whether microcredentials can be used to enhance employability, whether they can be used to widen pathways into from upper secondary to higher education, and whether they can be used to promote social inclusion. And the second phase, which looked at kind of evidence on and potential ways forward for governments on 4 key policy areas, namely funding, quality assurance, information and guidance, and collaboration with industry. And this project had 6 key outputs. The concise guidance paper is the paper that the OECD published last March, which I already mentioned, kind of looks at the evidence base to date on microcredentials. The second set of deliverables was the International Knowledge Workshop, which took place in March. We also organized 4 national workshops with the countries participating in the project. So Slovenia, of course, which many of you attended, but also Finland, Spain, and Slovakia. And the 2-part series of summary papers are 2 papers that are going to be published by the OECD in the coming weeks. As part of these summary papers, we are also publishing a kind of set of implementation and monitoring indicators, which will be a kind of self-assessment tool for governments to examine the state and implementation of the microcredential policies. And a final deliverable will be a public seminar kind of summarizing the findings of the project, which will take place probably early next year. And with that, I think I will give the speech. Let Izuka continue.
Thank you, Rosie. So, hello. Rosie just explained the development of microcredentials in OECD countries. So now I will use the remaining 5 minutes to see how governments are responding to this development. So this is an overview and also examples of like uses of public policies in OECD countries. And we looked at 4 policy levels just as an example. And we see that generally speaking, there are like 2 approaches across OECD countries. one is that the softer and also exploratory approach, and another is like harder and more integrated approach to micro-credential policy implementation. And if I pick the example of regulations and guidelines, in some cases, government makes regulatory changes, and in another case, government just publish non-binding guidelines for providers to follow, but it's not like a binded by law. So I'm not gonna go into details of each because I'm gonna show you examples. Yeah, so there are two approaches. That's what I wanted to tell with this slide. And then here, so if we look at the if you look at regulations and guidelines, as I said, there are two approaches. And then in Spain, for instance, Ministry of Universities adopted Royal Decree in 2021. And then in this way, micro-credentials are defined by law as one of the 5 unofficial credentials universities may offer. And then, but we only saw, as for now, Spain is the only country specifically defining micro-credentials in law with size. I mean, Hungary also has micro-credentials addressed in the Higher Education Act, but not with the size. So Spain is the only example we are aware of is the size also defined like up to 15 ECTS. And then in other cases, it's often that the government issues non-binding guidelines for providers. And then it's up to providers to decide whether they follow, or often they also like launch funded project for providers to follow the guideline. So yes, here I just wanted to look at the size because everybody asks, so how big should micro-credentials be? And then my answer would be, well, it depends on what you want to achieve with your definition. And in some cases, like for example, in Australia, the framework covers all types of education and training providers. So in this case, definition is quite broad. Micro-credential can be an hour, or it can be like up to around a year. So it's very broad definition. Whereas in Spain, they differentiate 5 types of non-official credentials, and micro-credentials being one of them. So in this case, micro-credentials are quite like narrowly defined and less than 15 ECTS. And I understand that in Slovenia, there is also an advanced study program. So when you make a definition for micro-credentials, if that's the case, then it will be up to your national context how you relate micro-credentials to advanced study programs and also other shorter programs. And on funding, public funding, again, we see 2 approaches. One is the more integrated one, and another one is exploratory. We see more examples of exploratory approach. So on this slide, we have example from the Netherlands, but I understand that also in Slovenia, you are also piloting micro-credentials in the higher education sector with 4 institutions using the RRF funding, EU's Recovery, Resilience and Facility funding. And then so there are many countries also piloting micro-credentials at the moment. We will have more examples of temporary funded initiatives in the upcoming paper so that you can see what others are doing. And more integrated approach. Again, here there are different approaches. In some cases, micro-credentials are integrated into core public funding to providers, or in another case, it could be part of like financing for learners, or it could be part of like individual learning account. So it really depends. But in the case of Finland, it's part of the core public funding allocation to higher education institutions. And then here it's on the quality assurance, but I'm aware of the time, and also I know that we have other quality assurance experts are presenting today after us, so I'm gonna skip this one. And then on information systems, countries are also advancing to develop online portals to help learners access micro-credential provision, like to see what offers are there. And then in Germany, White, maybe I'm pronouncing it wrong, but it is White lists further education programs offered by public and government recognized higher education institutions. And then the Irish example lists program developed as part of the microcredit project. So what I can say from these examples is that we are not aware of a very truly comprehensive online learning platform up to today, because the German example is only for public and government recognized institutions, and then IUA example as well. So it's either defined or like constrained to certain providers or certain programs. And so I would say that the OECD countries are on their way to achieve a true one-stop shop learning platform for micro-credentials. And then Slovenia may be the first one to achieve this. So these are the links to relevant OECD publications. As Rosie said, most importantly, we will have very comprehensive papers, 2 papers published in the next few weeks. So I hope that you will have a chance to look at them. With this, I will finish my presentation, and thank you very much to NACVIS colleagues again for inviting us to your important event.
Thank you, Shizuka. Thank you, Rosa. We're looking forward to the next papers, and we'll go over them gladly in the next few weeks, as you mentioned. Thank you. Next, since we're quite, our schedule is quite tight, so we'll continue next with Anna Gover, Director of ENCA, who will talk about approaches to quality assurance of microcredentials. So please, Anna, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Dear colleagues, thank you for the invitation to speak with you today. It's a great pleasure to see so many of the Slovenian higher education community online and listening. What I will do with this presentation is get a little bit of an insight into a recent report published by the I'm in QA project, which ENCA is part of. This is the project that supports the Bologna thematic peer group on quality assurance, and they have a specific work strand on micro-credentials, and the representatives of the Slovenian Quality Assurance Agency have been part of this group representing your country. And the report was published over the summer, and there's some further work coming out. So I will just highlight a few issues that have come out of this. But I would also, before I start, just like to pay credit to my colleague Elena Cielan, who authored the report and worked together with the members of the working group on preparing it. She's actually on maternity leave at the moment, which is why I'm presenting today. So, as I think we're all very well aware by now, micro-credentials are a big hot topic over recent years, but I think it's important to remember that they are not new. When I joined, or when I started working in higher education about 10 years ago, everybody was talking about MOOCs. MOOCs were the new big thing. We were talking about how they were going to revolutionize higher education. And we moved on, and now we're talking more generally about micro-credentials. So they're not new, but they've for sure gained prominence. And we also, I think, have a new set of terminology that we're using to speak about them. And one of the reasons they've gained prominence is the broader policy context, with more focus on lifelong learning and the need to provide opportunities for students and also workers to reskill and upskill in the context of the changing labour market. There's been quite a lot of previous work on the quality assurance of micro-credentials. Many of you will be aware of it. And the main messages coming out of this work has very much been that the Bologna process tools that we already have for quality assurance, so the European standards and guidelines for quality assurance, frameworks like ECTS and the qualifications frameworks, these also apply to micro-credentials. Yes, we need to adapt a little in the way we use them, but the main messages and the main principles of these tools are still relevant and usable. Similarly, the main principle that we speak about when we speak about quality assurance of higher education also applies to quality assurance of microcredentials, and that is that it is the providers that should have the primary responsibility for the quality and the assurance of that quality of all the education offering that they deliver. And coming out of that is very much the message that external quality assurance should be proportionate. And that's one of the things I want to speak a little bit more about today. Quality assurance agencies across the European higher education area have taken on a range of different roles in terms of quality assuring microcredentials. But I think we need to keep in mind that they are small. This is what the name says, and therefore we need to have a proportionate response on the system level for that. And as said, we have then in the past couple of years the I'm in QA project, which has been further exploring the state of play and preparing a set of reflective questions for the internal and external quality assurance of microcredentials. There are a lot of guidelines and recommendations already out there. So with the reflective questions, the idea was to provide institutions and agencies with a tool that could help them to reflect on how they adapt their own approaches to take into account microcredentials in a way that is sensitive to the existing context. So what do we see at the moment? As said, there is a very wide range of approaches and stages of implementation. Some countries are still very much at a discussion phase, thinking about how they're going to incorporate microcredentials into their higher education structures. Other countries are much further along than this. But what we generally see is that it is being preferable to use and adapt the existing approaches rather than to create entirely new frameworks for microcredentials. This ties into what I said about needing a proportionate approach. What's clear is that agencies that we work with have said that they're expecting guidance from national level, from their national authorities, and also from European level as to how to address quality assurance of microcredentials. And part of this ties into the need for further work on recognition of prior learning, stackability, and portability of microcredentials. But when we talk about quality assurance of microcredentials, the starting point for quality assurance is that we need to decide what is quality. And in the European context, we tend not to answer this because, or at least not explicitly, because we say, okay, quality is contextual. It's up to an institution to decide what it is it's trying to achieve. It's up to us to listen to students to understand what it is that they are aiming for. So we tend to define quality assurance in relation to addressing the fitness for purpose of the educational offering, which brings us then to a clear next question: what is the purpose of microcredentials? So from the work that we've done in the I'm in QA project, of course, we also went back and looked at previous articles and publications and research on this topic. And there was an article in 2015 which defined a set of reasons why higher education institutions would offer microcredentials. These included increasing visibility and reputation of institutions, attracting a diverse group of students, increasing an institution's responsiveness to the student and the labour market needs, and as a way of experimenting with new pedagogies and technologies in a smaller format than a full degree programme, and of course to generate additional income. And actually, not a lot has changed in 8 years. I think these motivations for institutions are still very much relevant. What we might add to this is perhaps the strategic importance of microcredentials for institutions, particularly when it comes to supporting the labour market and to developing partnerships with other either institutions or other organisations, as we've heard from the previous presentation. The offering of micro-credentials by European University Alliances is a clear example of this. And we've also seen more integration and flexibility between different tertiary education sectors, and micro-credentials have been seen as a way of supporting learners to move between those sectors. That's on the institutional side. But ultimately, when we talk about higher education, we should be focusing on supporting students in achieving what they want to do. So why is it that learners take micro-credentials? A number of different reasons have already been mentioned, and I would just briefly summarize these by dividing into two types of students. One type are those that are already enrolled in an institution and take micro-credentials as something additional to their degree program. Sometimes this is required by their degree program, that they take elective modules, but it might also be about personal interest or personal development, or professional development if they're also working at the same time, or they know what direction they would like their career to go in afterwards. However, one of the key things about micro-credentials is the appeal for lifelong learners. So it's important that we take into account their needs. And usually these are related to professional development, so around upskilling and reskilling, these buzzwords that we hear constantly at the moment. At the other end of the learner life, it may be around supporting access to higher education. So enabling a learner to have the requisite qualifications and proof of skills and knowledge that are needed in order to enroll on a degree program at various levels. And of course, for lifelong learners, there's also still the personal interest and personal development motivation. What's important to keep in mind is that lifelong learners tend to be a much more diverse student group, and this has significant implications for the course design and the quality assurance of that course. So when the working group that developed this report was looking into the different approaches for offering micro-credentials and then indeed for quality assuring it, they divided into two groups. And I should say this is specifically about higher education provision. So on the one hand, we have the approach of unbundling existing programs, and the previous speakers have already spoken a bit about this, that this is usually developed through the institution's usual curriculum design process, and therefore it's also usually covered by the institution's internal quality assurance process for students. However, in terms of quality assurance and in terms of curriculum design, it does require additional reflection on how the micro-credential sits when it is offered outside of the usual context. And we have here this sort of tension between curriculum design, which looks at a curriculum as a whole and the learner's journey from the start of the degree program to the end, the holistic view of that curriculum, versus the push for flexible learning paths, of which micro-credentials plays a part. What happens when you take that micro-credential or you take that course out of the broader context of the degree program and you offer it on its own? The other approach is developing micro-credentials completely independently. And what we've seen in Europe is that this is usually part of an institution's lifelong learning provision. Might also be tailor-made for or in partnership with other organizations. And usually we see that this is then covered by the institution's quality assurance processes for lifelong learning. In many cases, this is then similar to that for programs, but it might be a lighter touch approach. And some agencies, for example, in Croatia or in Estonia, they have specific standards for quality assurance of lifelong learning. So building on the outcomes of the report that was developed through the I'm in QA project, what the working group has most recently been developing is this set of reflective questions for internal and external QA. These will be published towards the end of the year, but I give you a bit of an insight here into what we've been looking at. And the first goes back to the motivations. So institutions should ask themselves, why is it that we're offering microcredentials and who are the target audiences? This would allow them to design processes with that ultimate aim in mind. But this second question is probably the most important one, is that how can the special characterizations of microcredentials be captured in the internal QA approach? This is very much in line with the messaging we're giving, is that it's not about developing entirely new QA approaches or systems for microcredentials, but using what you've already got and making sure they pay attention to the certain specificities of microcredentials. These include the short duration, the different contact with learners, flexible and responsive curriculum, different criteria for opening and closing a microcredential, partnerships with external organizations or perhaps just external teachers. For students, access to learning resources, responding to the diversity of learners, and ensuring adequate information provision and that the student voice is heard in the quality assurance of microcredentials. And of course, as we know, many or even most microcredentials are delivered online, or at least in a blended approach. So particular questions around the quality assurance of online provision also come into play here. When we talked to higher education institutions as part of the research work, there were a number of criteria that they identified as being most important when thinking about the QA of microcredentials. And these were having very well explicit defined learning outcomes, having transparent assessment methods, and having transparent and sufficient public information. And I think this public information issue is one that's perhaps a little bit neglected, but are we really ensuring that learners have enough information about what the content of the microcredential is and what they might be able to do with it afterwards? What's important is that the quality assurance approaches should not be too rigid, so they continue to support flexibility and responsiveness in curriculum design. When it comes to external quality assurance, agencies are encouraged to reflect on the role of your agency in supporting the quality assurance of microcredentials. And agencies across Europe have very different roles in terms of the scope and the remit of their work within their national system. So some of those roles in regard to microcredentials include being an expert body, so giving input into discussions at national level and international discourse in terms of the position of microcredentials and their recognition. Agencies also have a role to facilitate and lead that dialogue and peer learning, for example, between higher education institutions and other relevant stakeholders, in exactly the way that, that your agency is doing with this conference here today. Some agencies may be offering explicit frameworks for quality assurance, whereas others might look more on the side of offering support and guidance to institutions as to how to integrate quality assurance of microcredentials into their existing procedures. And in terms of the specific frameworks at external level, we see a range of different approaches. On the one hand, there's a standalone approach, so a specific framework for microcredentials. We don't see this very often. Malta is one example, but generally this is the exception. Other countries and agencies take a more scalable approach. Ireland, for example, they already had an approach for special purpose and minor award programs, which are less than a full degree, and they adapted this to also be then applicable for microcredentials. What we mostly see across Europe, however, is an integrated approach. So an adjustment to the existing quality assurance procedures, particularly at institutional level, in order to ensure that microcredentials are covered as part of this. And the final role that we see commonly for agencies is as a provider of information. And this might be, for example, by establishing a database or a register of microcredential providers or offerings, as you've seen some of the examples by the previous speaker. And as said, mostly what's happening is a reflection on the question of how do I adapt my existing procedures to address how an institution quality assures microcredentials. We also see a role for agencies in engaging with and supporting alternative providers that offer microcredentials, because this isn't something that is only done by higher education institutions. Some agencies have a specific mandate for this, whereas others are offering something voluntary. But here it needs to be clear then what is the benefit and the consequence for alternative providers for going through a process offered by a higher education quality assurance agency. So just to wrap up, the key principles that we draw out of this in terms of quality assurance microcredentials are very much around finding a balance between regulation, flexibility, and proportionality. We had at a recent meeting of the microcredentials working group for the project a brief session on what message would we like to give to our ministers in our national context when it comes to frameworks for microcredentials. And there was one very clear message that came out from everybody, and it was simply don't over-regulate. Yes, there's a need for framework. Yes, there's a need for guidance. But the risk is that if you go too far and make too rigid legal structures, that then it makes them very difficult to change as the higher education environment continues to evolve and as the role of microcredentials in that context, in that education ecosystem, continue to evolve. The issue around communication and transparency of information I've mentioned, and we often see there's a lack of this. And stakeholder engagement, of course, is one of the underpinning principles of quality assurance in general. But with microcredentials, we see that this brings into a much wider range of stakeholders. So it's important to engage with all of them. And ultimately, we keep in mind the end goal, which is around supporting student success. And I've mentioned already the need to engage with the wider group of stakeholders, because, of course, microcredentials are not unique to higher education. So when we're engaging with other providers, we also need to keep in mind the language that we're used and not to impose the higher education format of quality assurance on external providers. But clearly, if those providers are offering microcredentials with a specific aim of supporting access to or progression in higher education, then there's a clear benefit to a stronger communication and cooperation there. I mentioned the reflective questions that will be published at the end of the year. The other thing to look out for is that ECHA, the European Quality Assurance Register, are developing their database of external quality assurance results with a view to including microcredentials and microcredential providers in that database. There's a lot of testing going on at the moment, and we're hoping that that in the new year that function will be public on the database. So that's something to look out for. And with that, I say thank you very much for your attention. I hope it was interesting, and I wish you a very successful discussion for the rest of the afternoon.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for your contribution. Sure, it is a lot to think about, especially for us as a QA agency. So thank you for your contribution. Our next speaker, Mark Brown, Director of National Institute for Digital Learning at Dublin City University, is at the moment abroad with a very limited internet connectivity, so he cannot participate live. However, he filmed his presentation beforehand, and we have the presentation ready now. Tilen, you can roll the video.
let's talk about the future of microcredentials with an emphasis on the quality assurance of them. Is small really beautiful? Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Brown, and I'm a full professor and director of the National Observatory for Digital Education based at Dublin City University in Ireland. Using the visual metaphor on our screen and focus on small things and whether they come in quality packages, metaphorically, microcredentials, when done right, could be like that tiny caterpillar transforming into a beautiful butterfly. However, when done wrong, all we may end up with is a really fast caterpillar. I'm going to pick up on that metaphor a little later in the talk, but in the short time I have available, I want to cover three things. I want to extend the conversation already that you've had with Anna in particular around what quality agencies are doing, quality assurance agencies, globally in particular. What are leading or pioneering institutions up to when it comes to responding to quality assurance considerations? And lastly, where are the holes? What's keeping us from flying like that beautiful butterfly? So that's what I want to cover with you. Just before we get started, though, I want to emphasize why quality assurance is still such an important consideration when it comes to microcredentials. In March of this year, Hole & IQ repeated their survey, a global survey of institutional leaders around, in this case, the top barriers. And you can see that constraints of recognition and quality assurance remain the top barrier. And so whilst there's been some improvement there, I think this gives us a snapshot of that fact that quality assurance has certainly not gone away as a concern for both employers, for learners, for institutions, many different stakeholders when it comes to microcredentials. Okay, so you've already heard a little bit about what's going on with quality assurance agencies, in particular in Europe, from Anna. And I don't really feel the need to repeat what you've heard and some of the work that's already been done. We're certainly not starting from scratch in this space, particularly the MicroBowl project that preceded the work that you heard from Anna, published as recently as August. But what's happening outside of Europe? Well, earlier in the year, between February and the end of March, we had the privilege to work with the OECD to look at just that very question. And largely through desk research with some follow-up with key quality agency managers where time and connections were possible, we found three categories of response. First, in 25 plus OECD family or jurisdiction countries, there was no sign that anything had been done whatsoever in response to microcredentials and revising national framework standards, guidelines, processes, and so forth. We did detect some evidence of a plan or at least a commitment to doing something in the future, but it's very hard to tell. It's speculative. We think that most countries simply hadn't got to this issue at this point in time. Of course, this is a very fluid space. And so when this study was completed at the end of March, we've already seen some changes and initiatives around the world. I'll pick up on one of those shortly. In the second category, we found these countries, a handful of countries, where a deliberate decision had been made to align microcredential quality considerations with existing common standards and quality assurance processes. And you're probably already aware of those in Europe in particular. I single out Spain because I think that's a good case study, quite a scalable example, a large commitment to microcredentials, two agencies collaborating, and clearly European standards and guidelines being central to the discussions. And outside of Europe, I think I'm okay to say the UK is now outside of Europe. Some interesting examples here of a response. In this case, SQAA has adopted more of an enabling approach rather than seeing its role as to monitor quality. In issuing last year a set of characteristic statements for microcredentials, which ultimately lead to a series of questions that need to be considered. So this question approach is not new in many respects, giving institutions the opportunities to engage in the conversations they should be having around quality assurance at the local level. In Australia, actually quite a similar approach. One could argue that TESCA, the National Quality Assurance Agency, actually really moved some years ago to this more enabling approach, working with the sector for the sector rather than a central controlling approach. Australia last year launched its National Microcredentials Framework. The framework makes a commitment to quality assurance using existing standards and frameworks and guidelines. But what's interesting is, and you'll hear a little bit more about this shortly, the number of online microcredentials, TESCA, partly arising out of the COVID experience, have developed these good practice guidelines for learning on teaching online that map to existing quality standards and domains, but building on good practice from drawing on experts within the sector itself to produce these sorts of guidelines. And microcredentials integrate within such guidelines on the basis of their mode of delivery. Shifting to Canada for a minute, British Columbia has made a commitment to using existing quality assurance frameworks, and in this case, this is Ontario, the Ontario Universities Council on Quality Assurance, saying that they do not require separate approaches at an institutional level, that they can be embedded within existing quality assurance frameworks and processes, with one exception when they're a part of a new program. I'm going to come back to Ontario shortly because it is quite a scalable example, a more mature environment to just look at it in a little bit more detail. But the third category, where actually 3 countries have shown some evidence of actually developing quite specific guidelines and QA processes, Malaysia arguably is the best example of a very, very detailed approach to guidelines for microcredentials that align to the mainstream program guidelines. Of course, there's always a consideration of the cultural fit. Malaysia has also extended just recently some of those quality guidelines to industry providers. New Zealand, my country of birth, often gets acknowledged in this space, partly because it's claimed to be the first country to embed microcredentials into the National Qualification Framework. Very important to acknowledge that universities sit outside of that framework. That's something that people don't necessarily outside of New Zealand understand. So universities have their own approach that is cognizant of the larger framework, but they're responsible for their own quality considerations. And then Ireland, where I'm located now, also has done some work in this space. In fact, I'm share an example because I've been pretty centrally involved, if not actually the lead researcher in terms of a contract that we've had over the last year with the National Quality Assurance Agency, QQI, to develop statutory quality assurance guidelines for providers of blended and fully online programs. We made a decision to make these inclusive of microcredentials on the basis of mode of delivery. So they are not specific for microcredentials, but microcredentials are included in our considerations based on the delivery mode. Let me give you an example. These guidelines were actually only released officially, finally, after 2 iterations of public consultation in October, so last month, about 2 weeks ago. Here's an example of the domain related to staff training, professional development, and institutional support, where we've singled out, particularly for fully online delivery, that programs that are fully online, including microcredentials, if they're fully online, staff must be able to demonstrate previous experience of teaching online or participate in appropriate induction, training, professional development, and ongoing mentoring. The last thing that we would see from a quality perspective is that a teacher would be teaching online with no prior experience and no prior professional development and support. That's an important specific quality indicator for online delivery. So throughout those guidelines, there are just a handful, I think there are 10 in total, of particular quality considerations for fully online programs as opposed to those that are merely blended. A couple of things to also note globally, going back to the UK initially, that the British Accreditation Council have developed this voluntary scheme for universities and higher education institutions to have their microcredentials inspected for quality based on the standards and indicators you can see on the screen. I've called out participant support or learner support and development in particular as one to be thinking about. You'll see why later in what I have to share with you. The other thing is we should not forget the role that professional bodies, engineering bodies, AACSB in business or other accreditation bodies play, especially if we're focused on mode of delivery, because microcredentials are, it seems, very much interfacing with blended and online forms of delivery. So many of those professional bodies have actually already made initiatives to adapt their quality requirements for mode of delivery. Okay, so that's a very quick helicopter overview of some institutions outside, so agencies outside of Europe. And now let's turn our attention to what institutions might be doing that are regarded to be more mature in this space. When I say mature, well, how did we look and identify those that are considered to be more mature? Well, there are 3 quite well-known or high-profile portals that have been developed for microcredentials. And we looked at the institutions who had their microcredentials available through these national or regional portals as a method of saying, if you've got your credentials, your microcredentials through these portals available to all, that's an indication that you're more mature than perhaps other types of institutions, rightly or wrongly. So I'm returning back to Ontario. This is the Ontario portal for microcredentials. Around 1,800 microcredentials available through the portal. And what we did is we drilled down to all of the 50 plus institutions that offer microcredentials to see what they say about quality assurance. Notable as a quick sidebar, and to reiterate what I've already said, 88% of the microcredentials available in this portal are available fully online. So this is why there's this interface between the credential and a mode of delivery that also raises some interesting quality considerations. You know what we found from looking at those institutions? Nothing. There was no visibility whatsoever around going through their websites, their promotional material, just how they were approaching the quality assurance of the microcredentials they were offering. Given transparency as kind of a key principle of quality assurance, that was quite surprising to us. However, post this study, only back in July, a microcredential draft quality assurance framework for Ontario has been published. Went through a public consultation process that only finished a matter of weeks ago. And so I wonder in part whether this is a response to the fact that maybe there wasn't enough happening around institutional quality assurance. I'm speculating. I'm watching this development with interest. Let's move to Australia, where they also have their Microcred Seeker portal launched earlier in the year. Note of the microcredentials on offer through this portal. At the time when we did this work at the end of March, 93% of the microcredentials were being taught fully online. So again, emphasizing why online learning is part of the conversation we need to have. Within the portal, each microcredential is supposed to meet the requirements of a template, which includes quality assurance, but it really doesn't say much at all about quality assurance in the template. It's really just a one line. What we did find, and I'm pleased to report, that in Australia, when we drilled down to the institutions offering their microcredentials through this portal, we did find a handful, with very mature, very well-developed documentation related to the design, the development, the quality of their offerings. This is just one from Charles Sturt University. I could give further examples, but there are only a handful of them. But what we concluded from the study is that Australia was certainly the more mature in terms of institutional response. Turning to Ireland for a minute, where we also have a national portal, formally launched a few months after this research finished, but we went and did a retrospective analysis. So of the microcredentials on offer, a high proportion online or blended, and then what did we find of the institutions offering the microcredentials? Well, at the time, we found only one institution with anything really quite public about what it was doing in terms of quality assurance. I know in the case of my own institution, having reported this study, that there is now some information on our own portal about what quality assurance involves. We also quickly looked at some of the other better known country initiatives or in Europe. So this is in the Netherlands. And what's notable here is a commitment to a peer review approach to quality assurance that was going to kick in 2023. You hear different things depending on who you listen to in terms of what's really happening with this national initiative. But a commitment to peer review is a very, very commendable approach to quality assurance at a localized level. We did look at European University Alliances as well, because many of them talk about microcredentials, and we didn't find one single alliance on its website talking about what it would be doing around microcredentials and the quality. Very quickly then, I'm conscious of time, where are the holes? Well, if we base some of this analysis on those three portals that I described, none of the portals provide an opportunity for a quality rating of the microcredential. This might sound a bit controversial, but that's what MOOCs do. Learners are actually able to give a star rating and give comments, like when you review a hotel, you can put that feedback and make it publicly available. For me, this is a bit of a lost opportunity in closing the loop. There's very limited evidence of things like career guidance and support, learner support and development information, minimal to say the least. So these are two very big gaps as far as I'm concerned in quality indication. Limited details publicly, as you've seen, around the quality assurance processes, given that learners and employers have concerns. That's surprising. And little or no outcomes data, whether that be student satisfaction data or employability data. In many respects, there are really large holes when it comes to understanding outputs data, some of which should inform and help close the loop in our thinking around quality assurance. In fact, in the Australian case, there's even been now some negativity about the lack of good advice that's provided through the national portal, and maybe the national portal should be turned off, that it's simply not providing learners with the type of good advice that they need. So the general sentiment here is what happens in the classroom, whether that be physical or virtual, is not enough. It's all about all the other supports and guidances and so forth that need to be part of the package. Something really important that's missing also, that we incorporated certainly in the Irish guidelines that I referred to earlier, is what to do about microcredentials when learners are taking them outside of the country in which they're being offered. Actually, there are quite clear legal implications. There are issues even right down to whether you can offer something and guarantee that a student can complete when they may not have the type of bandwidth that's required to do so. So there are unique and additional quality considerations we would argue because of the mode of delivery when they're available to learners outside of country. That brings us to also some issues around, which I've written about, a bit of self-publicity here, around leadership. Internal structures, organizational structures for microcredentials, needing quality indicators that the right leadership's in place, the right structures are in place, the right people. If you want to read a little bit more, you can scan that QR code sorry for the blatant publicity, read this paper that we published earlier in the year. Also, another gap is around how institutions intend as a whole to both benchmark and review their offerings, their entire portfolio offerings. What we know is that quality self-assessment of digital teaching and learning is actually quite weak in Europe more generally, citing a study that I was involved in with the EUA. Only 12% of institutions back in the time this was done in 2020. So needing to have a plan around institutional benchmarking and quality self-assessment at an institutional level. I'm pretty much out of time, so to wrap up, a few final remarks. Yes, we have our European standards and guidelines and many other different frameworks and guidelines depending upon which sector we're talking about. Within European standards and guidelines, we also have a set of considerations for the quality assurance of e-learning provision. They are quite dated, pre-COVID, 1998. We are seeing at the country level some initiatives. I'm using the Irish example. Are they designed to be enabling or constraining is perhaps the question here, and do we need them for microcredentials, or is it more about the mode of delivery as in the Irish case? And then in the last column, we're seeing numerous initiatives throughout Europe. I'm involved in this one, the microcredentials, which is producing a benchmarking guide to really structure and support quality conversations within institutions. But there are several other benchmarking tools underway. There will be a European e-maturity model launched shortly for microcredentials as well, with European Commission funding. The question is, how do we align this work and develop a more connected credential ecology, not just for microcredentials, but for our programs more generally? And where do some of these additional quality considerations fit? To finalize the talk, I guess, to conclude, to reflect back on my original butterfly metaphor, how does one really become a beautiful butterfly? Well, I guess you really must want to fly so much that you're willing to give up being a caterpillar. So there may be some things that we do have to think about and rethink the implications rather than simply defend what we've always done in the past. That's open to conjecture and debate. I'm conscious I'm a little bit over time. I do want to just leave you with these 3 questions to consider over the course of your deliberations about quality assurance and microcredentials. Where do the European standards and guidelines fit? Where can we find better examples of what European institutions are doing for quality assurance? And then ultimately, given learners are critical stakeholders in this space, how might we bring them into the discussions around quality assurance as partners and not simply as the audience or the end user? I'll stop on that note. Thank you very much. And I hope I've given you food for thought at the very least. Cheers.
Sincere thank you to Mark for his willingness to prepare the video beforehand. And now we'll quickly move on to our part, the agency's part, about how to establish our external QA system. And with that, Gregor, you will start just as soon as I start to share the presentation.
Yeah.
Gregor, is it okay? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank
excellent.
you. Thanks, Natasha. So as Natasha mentioned, we will now try to use the following 10 minutes to, let's say, bridge the insights from the presentations we just heard and to bring them a bit closer to our national context and the goal of this conference, which is the discussion on how to set up the quality assurance system, quality assurance model for microcredentials in Slovenia. I would like to use this opportunity to thank all of our speakers for their interesting and very informative presentations, which will no question serve as a great foundation for the upcoming panel discussion. Natasha, can you please go forward? Yes, so now I'll briefly explain the ongoing activities in Slovenia with regards to the implementation and systemic regulation of microcredentials. So the resolution on the National Program of Higher Education to the year 2030, which is the key strategic document for the Slovenian higher education and the base for policy making in the next 10 years, aims to elevate the quality of higher education in Slovenia with different approaches, but at the same time gives special emphasis to the promotion of lifelong learning, which includes the accreditation and recognition of microcredentials and the necessity of acquiring diverse, high-quality knowledge and skills throughout the working life of an individual, as it says in the document. The Ministry of Higher Education, Science and Innovation has started to gradually introduce microcredentials into the Slovenian higher education area in the year 2022 as part of the project to reform higher education for a green and resilient transition. The pilot project aims to formally introduce microcredentials on Slovenian public higher education institutions until the year 2025 as a way to enable universities and the higher education system to respond more quickly to the changes in society and in the labor market with a highly skilled workforce as its main objective. Of course, to properly introduce microcredentials into the Slovenian higher education area, you have to secure a system which includes the necessary deliberation on how to include the microcredentials into the Slovenian qualifications framework, which represents a unified system of qualifications in Slovenia for the classification of qualifications into levels with regards to the learning outcomes with the intent to achieve transparency, comparability of qualifications in Slovenia. As far as we know, this question has not yet been completely resolved, but there are already ongoing discussions between the relevant stakeholders on how to work through this issue, and perhaps even our guests in the discussion will follow up on this question. Can you go to the next slide, please, Natasha? So when you're dealing with microcredentials, the problem is somewhat apparent that there is still some confusion with regards to the definition and structure of microcredentials, where some compromise has to be found, at least in the national context, before you can build a suitable quality assurance system. First of all, it should be emphasized that our national higher education institutions have been offering learning opportunities in small units for a long time. As Shizuko and Rosa observed, we have a well-established tradition of so-called supplementary study programs which are defined as a form of lifelong learning and are primarily designed to improve, to deepen knowledge. So can they be interpreted as bigger microcredentials with a range of 10 to 60 ECTS and with an already developed quality assurance system around them? A similar question is posed when dealing with parts of existing programs. So when we're talking about unbundling of existing programs, so can courses or modules be offered as microcredentials? Of course, in theory, these programs have already been accredited, but the question remains, can they serve their function as microcredentials since they were designed as part of study programs with specific goals and needs in mind, and also specific teaching methods? All of this was already mentioned by Anna as well before me. On the other hand, the question with regards to the mode of delivery was brought up by Mark, and it's a very important question to address as well. Since microcredentials should enable a more personalized, flexible, student-oriented approach, the mode of delivery should address these goals. Of course, question on how to assess new, especially online modes of delivery is not only important for microcredentials, but perhaps because of its prevalence in this type of study units, it's even more important that we find a way to approach this. What about the teaching methods and the structure of microcredentials? So can the same teaching methods focusing on individual work of students be applied to microcredentials as well? Do we have any defined ranges, ECTS ranges in mind? What is the minimal size of microcredentials? Another important consideration relates to stackability. Stackability is seen as one of the potential ambitions of microcredentials, but of course, simply stacking different microcredentials solely on basis of the ECTS points probably shouldn't lead to a full degree, so rules and guidelines have to be established in that regard as well. These are just some of the important hesitations we have at the agency right now, definitely considerations that should be addressed before the quality assurance system can truly be made fit for purpose, fit for microcredentials. And Natasha will continue to speak a bit more on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Gregor. So when we're talking about building the external QA system, we already established at the agency that we are not inclined towards first or any accreditation of microcredential. So we're definitely thinking of assessment of the quality of microcredentials within the framework of reaccreditation of higher education institutions. However, we are thinking of two options of external quality assurance. So as it was mentioned today a few times, we can have unbundling the study programs, and their microcredentials could be assessed within the framework of self-evaluation of the existing study program, if the microcredentials are designed from modules or learning units or an existing and accredited study program. The second option is to create a microcredential as a result of a connection to the industry. And there we could look as a separate quality system for microcredentials, as I mentioned, within the procedures for reaccreditation of higher education institutions. We are also thinking what kind of criteria we will use. One option is to use the existing criteria or maybe add new ones to the existing ones. As we've heard, there is a clear connection between microcredentials and online or blended teaching and learning. So we are also thinking about how to include this into the criteria or add new criteria regarding to the mode of delivery. How we will test or get answers to those questions, we plan to do pilot evaluations of microcredentials in 2024. And we will have more opportunity to test the methodology, to find answers in collaboration with other stakeholders, especially with higher education institutions. To conclude our brief view in the existing state in Slovenia, we are definitely thinking how to have an overview of microcredentials. Is it some sort of portal? Is it a registry within the ministry? We don't know, but we certainly think it would be a good idea to have a common point where all the stakeholders could go and search for information. We think that the guidelines for microcredentials are necessary. We don't want to have an over-regulated system. However, we do feel that we need some sort of guidelines, and they are being prepared by the ministry as we speak. Like I said, a lot of answers to the questions and potentially even new questions will get through our pilot evaluations in 2024, so next year. And all of this could lead to potential change of legislation and even our criteria. Obviously, this is not something we can decide on our own. We have other stakeholders to talk to and decide together. And with this, I will conclude the first part of our conference, and we'll move to the second part of our conference, to the panel discussion. Therefore, I will switch to Slovene now. Nadaljevali bomo torej s panelno razpravo in zato vabim moderatorja Klemna Šubica, da prevzame drugi del posveta.
Saša, hvala lepa. Spoštovani, najprej bi se vam rad zahvalil za udeležbo in seveda tudi vsem gostujočim predavateljem, tudi vama seveda Nataša in Gregor, za izjemno zanimive in poglobljene vpoglede v razvoj sistemov mikrodokazil tako po Evropi kot širše. Kot rečeno, dobrodošli na drugem delu nacionalnega posveta, na panelni razpravi na temo oblikovanja sistema kakovosti mikrodokazil. Med panelisti pozdravljam dr. Klaudijo Kutner iz Univerze na Primorskem, dr. Jano Arbajter iz Univerze v Ljubljani, gospod Ines Gergorič iz Gospodarske zbornice Slovenije, gospod Dušo Marjetič iz Ministrstva za visoko šolstvo, znanost in inovacije, dr. Boštjana Vlaoviča iz Univerze v Mariboru in gospoda Andreja Pirjevca iz Študentske organizacije Slovenije. Lepo pozdravljeni. Moje ime je Klemen Šubic, prihajam iz NAKVIS-a in zaupana mi je bila tale naloga oziroma čas, da moderiram to panelno razpravo, ki naj bi bila predvsem namenjena temu, da osvetli različna spoznanja in izkušnje ter naslovi nekatere izzive, s katerimi se srečujemo pri oblikovanju oziroma vzpostavljanju sistema kakovosti mikrodokazil v Republiki Sloveniji. Javni visokošolski zavodi sodelujete v okviru projekta reforme visokega šolstva za zelen in odporen prehod v družbo 5.0, znotraj katerega so seveda naslovljena tudi ta vseživljenjsko učenje in pa mikrodokazila. In ravno ta mikrodokazila naj bi pomagala zapolniti vrzel vseživljenjskega izobraževanja v terciarnem izobraževanju ter naslovila tudi potrebe po ključnih kompetencah, ki jih omenja že Evropski referenčni okvir za vseživljenjsko učenje. Te kompetence naslavljajo predvsem družbene, osebne, kulturne in pa potrebe trga dela. Pomemben vezni člen, kot smo danes že nekajkrat slišali, je pa seveda vzpostavitev sistema kakovosti, tako notranjega kot zunanjega. Definicijo med priporočili definicijo o mikrodokazilih nekako imamo definirano, vendar ta definicija sama po sebi ne opredeljuje širšega spektra vsebin, pogojev, načinov mikrodokazil. Tako da, dobrodošli panelisti, pa mogoče najprej začnem z prvim vprašanjem, ki bo namenjeno gospe Duši Marjetič, in sicer, a nam lahko predstavite, kje se trenutno nahajamo, nam lahko na kratko opišete napredek na področju razvoja sistema mikrodokazil in mogoče se skličete tudi na kakšne strateške usmeritve oziroma načrtovane aktivnosti za naprej.
Hvala za povabilo, tudi hvala za super izbor predstavitev v dopoldanskem delu, ki mislim, da so nam dale zelo dober pregled, kje smo. In ena od stvari, ki bi res opozorila, da smo vsi pozorni, je, da mikrodokazila so globalni fenomen v visokem šolstvu. To pomeni tudi globalna ponudba, multijezikovna, ne samo slovenska, in zato, Klemen, ker si mi izzval, pa mislim, da smo vso teorijo že slišali dopoldne, bi res opozorila, da vidimo veliko dogajanja v pilotnih projektih. Nazadnje, ko smo šteli, mislim, da je preko 70 mikrodokazil različnih vrst se nam obeta. Pristopi oblikovanju mikrodokazil vidimo, da so podobni, kot smo slišali danes, ali so direktno delani v sodelovanju z gospodarstvom, ali so delani zato, ker je visokošolski zavod identificiral pač preko svojih mehanizmov, da je neko znanje potrebno na trgu dela, ali so pa delani za osebnostni razvoj posameznika. Nekaj, kar ne opažamo, in to je, jaz osebno ocenjujem, da je to dobro, je, da ni mikrodokazil na zalogo. Vsaj do zdaj jih pri monitoringu pilotnih projektov nismo videli. Kar bi pa res opozorila, pa je, da ne opažamo tudi nekega obsežnega razvoja online ponudbe mikrodokazil. Lahko da bo to še prišlo, lahko da ne. Tako da ta del, kako neko se rekel, nacionalno, ki smo trenutno, jaz pričakujem, da se bodo res mikrodokazila v širšem obsegu pilotno izvajala, če rečemo študijsko leto 24 ali pa leto 24, ker potem v 25 se morajo tudi zaključiti, tako da upam, da bo vsem pilotnim projektom uspelo vsaj 2 generacije poslušalcev speljati čez mikrodokazila. Sami na ministrstvu pa vmes bolj skrbimo z vidika sistema, Kje smo pa tu? Omenjeno je že bilo, da se pogovarjamo glede umeščanja mikrodokazil v slovensko ogrodje kvalifikacij. Tukaj nekje vemo, da ne bodo poklicne kvalifikacije, pogovarjamo se, ali bodo to dodatne kvalifikacije, ali bodo šle v isti steber, ali bo to ločen steber. Se pravi, tukaj smo se ustavili, to je diskusija med 3 ministrstvi, Ministrstvo za delo, za izobraževanje.
Ministry of Labour, Education and Higher Education. So this...
Kar še opažamo je tudi, da je že zdaj, ko se pogovarjamo s pilotnimi projekti, da je največ vprašanj glede zbiranja, vodenja podatkov v obliki mikrodokazila, kakšen dokument bo to, tako da v glavnem se s tem ukvarjamo na ministrstvu in zato smo se tudi odločili, da pripravimo nek vodnik, priročnik po mikrodokazilih, ki pa sledi temu, kaj si visokošolski zavodi želijo, da bi bilo definirano na nacionalni ravni. In če mi mogoče dovoliš kot uvod ali pa izziv predstavnikom z univerz pa z gospodarstva, je, da trenutno smo zaznali, da je želja, da bi imeli nek nacionalni okvir za umestitev mikrodokazil v sistem kakovosti visokega šolstva, to je to, o čemer se pogovarjamo danes, potem tudi v zakonodajo, kdo bo lahko mikrodokazila izvajal, kako v smislu tudi habilitacij profesorjev, ali kako bomo lahko vključevali strokovnjake iz prakse. Zakaj grem take detajle? Tukaj se srečamo z ureditvijo v zakonodaji, ne želimo, da bi zakonodaja, to je zakon o visokem šolstvu, omejeval izvajanje mikrodokazil. In pa najpomembnejše vprašanje, kako se bodo mikrodokazila financirala, ko bo konec pilotnih projektov. Tako da jaz se bom tu ustavila, pa dam besedo še drugim.
Mogoče samo še pod vprašanje, ali je predvideno tudi v zakonodaji, v spremembi zakonodaje, tudi definiranje zunanjega sistema kakovosti za mikrodokazila?
Ja, to je pa dobro vprašanje v bistvu, ker to je nekaj, kar morajo pilotni projekti pokazati, je pa še prostor, da se v novi zakonodaji to uredi.
Vkolikor bi bila potreba predvidena.
Absolutno.
Okay, hvala, Duša. Mogoče nadaljujemo kar direktno z predstavniki univerz javnih, pa mogoče neko splošno vprašanje. Na kakšen način ste se lotili oblikovanja mikrodokazil, iz česa ste izhajali, oziroma kakšna mikrodokazila pravzaprav želite ponuditi? Pa mogoče začnemo z Univerzo na Primorskem.
Hvala lepa, lepo pozdravljeni. Najprej hvala, da imam priložnost biti tukaj danes z vami. Ja, tako kot vse druge univerze in pa fakultete za informacijske študije smo se zadeve lotili v okviru pilotnih projektov. In smo zelo veseli, da imamo to priložnost, ker brez tega projektnega puša v ozadju bi veliko težje tako intenzivno začeli z tem urejanjem. Pa vseeno mislim, da je na vsaki univerzi malo drugače potekalo. Pri nas smo se odločili, da smo najprej se začeli pogovarjati z gospodarstvom, z lokalnim okoljem. Pri nas imamo svet zaupnikov, to je rektorično posvetovalno telo, pa smo rekli, evo, mi imamo zdaj sredstva, da ponudimo programe vseživljenjskega učenja, povejte, kaj rabite. In smo tako preko teh testnih izvedb raznih programov izpopolnjevanja za različna področja, od poslovnih ved do računalništva, do računalniške varnosti, kriptografije in podobno, naredili cel kup vsebin, ki jih potencialno vidimo kot vsebine, ki jih lahko naša univerza ponuja kot mikrodokazilo. Bi pa želela opozoriti na to, da mi govoriti o mikrodokazilu ne moremo. To me malo zmotilo, ko je bilo prej povedano, da se bo v letu 2024 naredila pilotna evalvacija mikrodokazila. Ampak predno mi lahko formalno govorimo o mikrodokazilih, potrebujemo nekako nacionalni okvir. Mi razvijamo, ampak še vedno je to klasično vseživljenjsko učenje, ni pa kot mikrodokazilo, ki ga v svetu poznamo. Zato se bi mi zelo želeli, da bi čim prej uredili ta nacionalni okvir, kdaj lahko rečemo, da je nekaj mikrodokazilo. In Zakaj čim prej? Zato, ker ne samo, da se pogovarjamo z lokalnim okoljem, pa z našimi diplomanti in to, kaj so tisti upskillingi pa reskillingi, ki so potrebni v njihovem delovnem okolju. Nastopamo tudi v Evropski univerzi, nastopamo v evropskem prostoru. Na našem univerzi je primer novega evropskega Bauhausa. Imamo prvo vozlišče Akademije novega evropskega Bauhausa, v okviru katerega v bistvu razvijamo mikrodokazila za gradbeni ekosistem, za v bistvu naslavljanje iniciative novega evropskega Bauhausa pa zelenega prehoda. Ampak predno ta nekak cilj je do leta 2030 izobraziti 3 milijone gradbenih delavcev z temi novimi koncepti, ampak predno mi prevzamemo to vlogo v Evropi s postavljanjem novih vozlišč po drugih državah Evrope, moramo vedeti, kakšne so pravila znotraj Slovenije, da lahko rečemo, da je mikrodokazilo. Zato bi v bistvu kot prvo izpostavila, da mi govorimo o mikrodokazilu, ampak mikrodokazilo je v resnici listina, ki pove, da je nekdo dobil kompetence v okviru nekega usposabljanja ali izobraževanja. In če želimo to implementirati tudi v te dodatne poklicne klasifikacije v Sloveniji, potem rabimo spremeniti zakon o visokem šolstvu, kdaj se lahko javna listina podeli. Imamo dve možnosti. Eno je, da se da nov člen v zakon, da je mikrodokazilo javna listina, drugo pa je možnost, da se opredeli na nacionalni ravni, vsaj tako vidimo pri nas, da so mikrodokazila v resnici neke vrste študijski programi izpopolnjevanja. In s tem se izognemo problemu novega zakona, da lahko javne listine podeljujemo. Drugo je, da bi si želeli, da bi na nacionalni ravni v bistvu delali zgolj evalvacijo mikrodokazil, ne pa akreditacije, zato ker če se delajo akreditacije na nacionalni ravni, potem bomo prepočasni. Pri mikrodokazilih je pomembno, da smo dovolj hitri pa fleksibilni, da sledimo trendom, ki jih družba potrebuje. Vseeno pa so neki okviri, recimo obseg kreditnih točk, potem koliko let, kar danes ni bilo izpostavljeno, ali mikrodokazilo za vse večne čase, tako kot je študijski program, ali ima omejen rok trajanja. Menim, da bi bilo primerno, da v nacionalnem okviru se določi, da v bistvu univerze akreditiramo, interno akreditiramo mikrodokazilo, ki pa ga moramo ustrezno posodabljati oziroma ga ukiniti. Je samo trajanje, recimo pri nas v okviru GDI-ja imamo 90 ljudi na tem NO projektu sodeluje, smo nekako presodili, da bi bilo smotrno na 3 leta mikrodokazilo reakreditirati interno, pa seveda že prej pa posodabljati, kolikor do te potrebe pride. Potem zelo pomembno se nam zdi, da se delajo, da ne bo kar vse življenjsko učenje, ki ga na univerzi delamo, bilo zdaj mikrodokazilo, ampak dejansko, da v mikrodokazila grejo res samo tiste prestižne, relevantne vsebine. Zato bi v samem tem internem postopku želeli, oziroma bi želeli, da na nacionalni ravni se zapišejo te osnovni pravila igre. Recimo za mikrodokazilo je potrebno izkazovati ustrezne reference nosilcev, kdo so lahko nosilci, kdo so lahko izvajalci, da mora biti zagotovljeni ustrezni infrastruktura za ponujanje mikrodokazil, da morajo v bistvu imeti zraven k vlogi za senat priloženo zelo dobra utemeljitev, zakaj je smiselno to mikrodokazilo implementirati, in priložiti tudi mnenje gospodarske zbornice, mnenje obrtne zbornice ali pa mnenje nekih mednarodnih strokovnjakov, več takih različnih metod. Smo zapisali vsi v naših internih navodilih, v osnutku internih navodil, in izreden pomemben element je sistem samoevalvacije. Tako kot pri študijskih programih menimo, da bi bilo nujno potrebno, da se mikrodokazila tudi samo evalvirajo. Kar se tiče hibridnosti usmerjeno na študente, ki je bilo rečeno, da veliko te ponudbe mikrodokazil naj bi bilo na online. Jaz mislim, da vseeno so vsebinska področja, kjer se na spletno izobraževanje ne bo išlo, tako da bi predlagala, da ostanejo vse možnosti, se pravi od online do klasičnega elementa, ne. Tako da toliko nekako za začetek, ne bom predolga.
Hvala lepa. Pa mi dovolite še mogoče 2 podvprašanji.
No, dajte.
Preden damo besedo še ostalima 2 predstavnikoma univerz. In sicer prvo vprašanje bi bilo vezano na sistem kakovosti. Ali ste razmišljali, ko ste oblikovali mikrodokazila, že o samem sistemu, kako naj bi izgledal? Omenili ste sicer neke elemente, ampak ali ste ga tudi predvideli oziroma oblikovali hkrati z krajšo učno in fleksibilno enoto, ki pripelje do mikrodokazila?
Ja, smo že oblikovali. Imamo osnutek že pripravljen. Se pravi, zdaj najprej osnovni element je, da smo si zadali, da mikrodokazilo se pripravi učni načrt mikrodokazila, tako kot je učni načrt predmeta z ustreznimi modifikacijami, a ne? Ampak se pravi, da se opredelijo vsi te elementi, tudi na v bistvu načini ocenjevanja in preverjanja znanja, ne. Seveda smo opredelili, da je mikrodokazilo opravljeno ali ni opravljeno, ampak je potrebno pa v učnem načrtu napisati minimalne standarde, da se pridobi to potrdilo o opravi. Potem je potrebno recimo zapisali smo si, da nosilec mikrodokazila mora biti zaposlen na naši univerzi. Izjeme dovoljujemo zgolj, kolikor se mikrodokazila delajo v okviru Evropske univerze Transform for Europe, kjer članica smo, oziroma v okviru prej omenjenega vozlišča novega evropskega Bauhausa, kjer smo tudi, imamo tako mednarodni strokovni odbor, ne. Potem tako da smo cel sistem, no, kot rečeno, želeli bi, da 3 leta velja mikrodokazilo, po 2 letih se lahko da vloga na senat za podaljšanje, ne, ali pa da se ukine. Tudi cel sistem razpisa, kako izgleda razpis za mikrodokazila 2-krat na leto. Bi si želeli, da bi bilo fleksibilno, ampak z odprtim rokom, tudi z možnostjo, da se mikrodokazilo izvede v odvisnosti od števila prijav. In želja na naši univerzi je, da mikrodokazila postanejo naša osnovna dejavnost, se pravi, da ni to nekaj zraven, ampak da se naši visokošolski učitelji in drugi strokovnjaki v svoje osnovne delovne obveze imajo raziskovalno delo, delo na študijskih programih, kakor tudi ponudbi mikrodokazil. Seveda, dokler imamo strani ministrstva za to namenjene sredstva, je to malo lažje predvideti, ne? Potem, ko bo pa teh sredstev več ne bo, pa verjamem, da se bojo splošna sredstva temeljnega stebra financiranja univerze toliko povečala, da se bomo lahko šli tudi teh zgodb. Smo pa predvideli, da v bistvu se naredi tudi cenik mikrodokazil, tako da v bistvu se uporablja cenik za mikrodokazila, ki jih ne ponujamo na univerzi iz javnih sredstev, ampak
A ste se odločili, predvsem, če uporabim tujko, za unbundling, se pravi, da ste razčlenili obstoječe vsebine akreditiranih študijskih programov, jih razčlenili na manjše enote in jih boste ponujali kot mikrodokazila, ali ste šli v popolnoma nove oblike in vsebine, ki jih do zdaj še ne ponujate?
Ja, v resnici smo šli v obratno smer. V okviru mikrodokazil razvijamo vsebine, ki jih želimo ponujati kot mikrodokazilo in jih hkrati pripoznavati v študijskih programih kot izbirne vsebine. To je primarni element. So pa seveda tudi obratni. Se pravi, nismo pa šli iz tega stališča, da v bistvu študijske predmete vzamemo za mikrodokazilo, ampak obratno. Se pravi, inovativne stvari, tisto, kar pač kaže trend, ne.
Hvala lepa. Mogoče Univerza v Ljubljani odziv? Kako ste se vi lotili oblikovanja krajših in fleksibilnih učnih poti, iz česa ste izhajali in kaj želite ponuditi?
Seveda, lep pozdrav in najlepša hvala za povabilo, možnost sodelovanja v tej razpravi. Ja, na Univerzi v Ljubljani bom rekla na dva načina. En način je bil v bistvu aktualen pregled stanja v tujini, kaj se dogaja v tujini, kakšne ponudbe so zunaj na trgu, kako so se tega lotile države oziroma druge univerze. Hkrati smo pa pogledali tudi stanje v Sloveniji in zelo podrobno smo pogledali, kaj obstaja trenutno na trgu na področju vseživljenjskega učenja, kakšna usposabljanja, kdo so izvajalci, koga naslavljajo, kakšne so vsebine, in potem smo na podlagi tega na nek način začeli z oblikovanjem usposabljanj, kot jim mi rečemo, usposabljanj z mikrodokazili, krajših usposabljanj. In zdaj izkazalo se je sledeče. Trenutno imamo v Sloveniji en kup usposabljanj, ki niso nujno regulirana, imenujemo jih vseživljenjsko usposabljanje oziroma vseživljenjsko učenje, raznih izvajalcev, SPAA, posameznikov, DO in vsega tega, in teh je čez 3000 samo v eni od podatkovnih baz, ki smo jih pogledali za preteklo leto. In smisel usposabljanja z mikrodokazili je potem seveda logičen, da zadevo uredimo zakonsko, regulativno tudi na nacionalni ravni, in da pač potem seveda univerza bdi nad usposabljanjem, seveda tudi s preverjanjem in pa zagotavljanjem kakovosti tovrstnih usposabljanj, ki bi jih potem nudili. No, in potem smo začeli v bistvu na podlagi nekih potreb na trgu in pa tega, kaj se dogaja in kaj bi bilo potrebno nasloviti, povezovati tudi z zunanjim okoljem. Zelo intenzivno sodelujemo z organizacijami zunanjega okolja in pri tem mislim podjetja, javno upravo in pa tudi civilno družbo. In na eni strani v bistvu oblikujemo usposabljanja oziroma poskušamo oblikovati usposabljanja na zelo podoben način, kot je kolegica s Primorske univerze omenila, skupaj z organizacijami zunanjega okolja, glede na njihove potrebe, glede na njihove želje. Gre namreč za dejansko, bom rekla, demand driven, povpraševanje, kaj si želijo, in poskušamo zadeve pripraviti na ta način v njihovem sodelovanju. Drug način, ki se ga lotevamo, pa je dejansko glede na potrebe družbe, kot je bilo že omenjeno prej pri predstavitvah, ena od izmed možnosti. Torej, kaj so tiste ključne potrebe, izzivi v družbi, ki jih je potrebno nasloviti, da bodo posamezniki pridobili določena znanja, kompetence, in na podlagi tega oblikujemo usposabljanja z mikrodokazili. Moram priznati, da trenutna izkušnja, bom rekla, zadnjega pol leta ali pa 9 mesecev trajanja pilotov, kaže na to, da je največ usposabljanj z mikrodokazili, ki jih bomo oblikovali, vseeno tistih, ki prihajajo na podlagi potreb gospodarstva oziroma trga dela, so zelo specifična. Pogosto prihaja tudi do tega, da gre na nek način za usposabljanja, ki so specifično oblikovana za določeno podjetje ali pa določenega naročnika. In z tega vidika razmišljamo tudi o tem in se resno, smo mnenja na Univerzi v Ljubljani, da smo mi tisti, ki moramo preverjati kakovost samega usposabljanja z interno evalvacijo, seveda, da pa, kot je kolegica iz Primorske univerze omenila, nekega zunanjega, eksterne akreditacije samih mikrodokazil, samega usposabljanja se ne moremo iti, ker moramo biti hitro odzivni na potrebe trga. Dejansko izkušnja kaže, da podjetja želijo sodelovati z univerzami, želijo usposabljanj, ki so oblikovana na univerzah, želijo usposabljanj, na katerih sodelujejo strokovnjaki zaposleni na univerzah oziroma tudi zunanji strokovnjaki, ki pa gredo čez neki interni proces presoje kakovosti. Ne moremo preprosto kar vsakega vključiti v usposabljanja z mikrodokazili. Seveda smo absolutno mnenja, da je strokovnjake iz zunanjega okolja potrebno vključevati, ampak tudi zato bi bilo treba razmisliti o kakšnem sistemu prožnih habilitacij, vsaj za strokovnjake, ki bi sodelovali. Vsekakor smo mnenja, da nosilci usposabljanj so zaposleni na Univerzi v Ljubljani v tem primeru. Kar je pa ključno, kar poudarjamo na Univerzi v Ljubljani in tudi vsi izvajalci pilotov na naši univerzi se s tem strinjajo, da se moramo zavedati razlike, da da je vsako mikrodokazilo oziroma usposabljanje z mikrodokazilom že del vseživljenjskega učenja. To drži, ampak ni pa vsako vseživljenjsko učenje tudi avtomatsko mikrodokazilo. In to mora biti zelo pomembna stvar, ki se jo moramo zavedati, ko se bodo oblikovale nacionalne smernice. Mi vseživljenjsko učenje vidimo kot 4. steber univerze, poleg seveda vseh 3 stopenj in vsega, kar imamo. Zelo pomemben del, zelo pomemben steber na univerzi, ampak kot sem omenila, mikrodokazilo je vseživljenjsko učenje, ni pa vsako vseživljenjsko učenje tudi mikrodokazilo. In mislim, da je to tista ključna stvar, ki jo moramo ponotranjiti tudi mi med sabo. Zdaj, zelo konkretno bom rekla, vsa oblikovanja, pa prihod oziroma bom rekla, prihajamo v tisto prvo fazo testiranj počasi, ko bomo mogoče prvo testno izvedbo že začeli izvajati samih usposabljanj. Ugotavljamo, da pač tega ne moremo narediti brez jasnih analiz, pregledov stanja, komunikacije z deležniki, ki sodelujejo, seveda jasno določiti ciljne javnosti, koga želimo naslavljati s temi mikrodokazili, za koga jih oblikujemo in posledično je to seveda tudi odvisno, koliko časa je veljavno neko mikrodokazilo. Mi se o konkretnih časovnih okvirih glede tega še nismo pogovarjali. Je pa seveda spet odvisno, ko govorimo o nekih mikrodokazilih, ki so specifično narejena za neko konkretno organizacijo, je lahko to tudi enkratna zadeva. Moramo se zavedati, da v prihodnje lahko pride tukaj tudi, da morebitni konflikt interesov, gre za zaupna usposabljanja, neke zaupne podatke. Lahko govorimo tudi o poslovnih skrivnostih. Podjetja prihajajo do nas, reče, poglejte, mi imamo tak problem, lahko na naši situaciji razložite, naredimo usposabljanje, naši zaposleni dobijo neke kompetence, neka znanja, tako da tudi tega se moramo zavedati, da seveda bodo obstajala mikrodokazila neke splošne narave oziroma, bom rekla, ki izhajajo iz družbenih potreb, bodo pa obstajala tudi zelo specifična usposabljanja z mikrodokazili, ki bodo enkratna, dvokratna ali pa bodo dejansko samo za individualnega partnerja pripravljene in se ne bodo replicirale na ta način. To so naše izkušnje. Mi smo v intenzivnem sodelovanju z gospodarsko zbornico, tudi z SRIPI sodelujemo, ves čas smo z njimi v kontaktu. Se obveščamo, želimo njihov feedback pri oblikovanju, torej ne delamo tega v izolaciji, ampak tokrat dejansko delamo tovrstna usposabljanja v sodelovanju z zunanjim okoljem, kar se mi zdi izjemno pomembno. Toliko mogoče v tej fazi na kratko.
Hvala lepa. Univerza v Mariboru, kakšne so pa vaše izkušnje oziroma iz česa ste vi izhajali?
Ja, najlepša hvala, pozdrav vsem udeležencem. Vidim, da se nas je zbrala kar lepa skupina, kar me veseli. Na Univerzi v Mariboru smo opravili marsikatero razpravo, o kateri smo se danes že pogovarjali. Ustanovili smo Center za vseživljenjsko učenje, kjer dejansko pripravljamo strokovno podporo in iščemo načine, kako integrirati vseživljenjsko učenje v del delovanja naše univerze in se ob tem seveda v čim večji meri, kot je že bilo tudi prepoznano povsod drugje po svetu, nekako naslanjati na obstoječe preverjene mehanizme z seveda mislijo na to, da je vseživljenjsko učenje ima svoje specifike. Prva odločitev, ki je bila pomembna, je to, da že kar sam odgovorim na vprašanje, ali bomo delali unbundling, ali bomo zadeve pogledali drugače. Seveda z vidika raznih kazalnikov ali pa številk bi rekli, bomo kar naredili unbundling, pa bo vsaka učna enota postala svoje mikrodokazilo, tako že imamo mikrodokazila, to se je znalo slišati tudi od vidnih predstavnikov iz svetovnega raziskovalnega področja, vendar to ocenjujemo na Univerzi v Mariboru, da ni smotrno, da ni pametno. Da to ni smotrno, kažejo tudi prvi rezultati. Tisti, ki ste podrobneje prebrali študijo OECD-ja in UNESCO ste verjetno zaznali, da tam, kjer so postopali na ta način, so se mikrodokazila kot taka razvrednotila in so dejansko delodajalci ponovno začeli v večji meri prepoznavati diplome kot tisto, kar je relevantno. Osebno lahko tukaj zdaj komentiram še to, da jaz menim, da je v primeru mikrodokazil manj je več. Se pravi, da je pomembno, tako kot so že moji predhodnici povedali, izdelati mikrodokazila, ki bodo relevantna, ki bodo sodobna in ki bodo izdelane že za vnaprej znano populacijo. Le na tak način lahko uspejo. To, kar je Mark povedal v predstavitvi, pa še par kakih drugih ugotovitvah njihovih raziskav je, da pogosto ta mikrodokazila, ki so narejena preveč na splošno in brez sodelovanja z deležniki, enostavno niso tako dobro obiskovana. Tako da kljub temu, da smo ljudje kdaj v preteklosti že skočili na tak termin, jaz predlagam, da tukaj res temeljito razmislimo. Na Univerzi v Mariboru smo v okviru Strateškega sveta za vseživljenjsko učenje, v katerega smo vključili tudi predstavnike delodajalcev, pa profesorje z različnih področij, različnih vidikov, da so prisotni, opravljamo to razpravo. Pripravljamo sedaj že drugo različico smernic za razvoj mikrodokazil na Univerzi v Mariboru. Te smernice so bile prva različica obravnavana konec junija na seji za komisiji za izobraževanje in študij, kamor smo povabili tudi koordinatorje mikrodokazil. Na Univerzi v Mariboru ima vsaka članica imenovanega svojega koordinatorja za razvoj mikrodokazil. Pri nas je specifika pri NO projektih ta, da imamo nekaj pilotnih projektov na nivoju univerze. V okviru teh pilotnih projektov probamo urediti sistemsko podporo za vse članice. Potem pa ima vsaka članica tudi lastni pilotni projekt, v katerem razvija svoje področje. Tako da najširši ta forum, kjer smo prisotni vsi, so torej prodekani za izobraževalno dejavnost in koordinatorji za mikrodokazila, kjer obravnavamo smernice in o tem razpravljamo. Na to pa v okviru posameznih članic te zadeve izvajajo v okviru svojega pilotnega projekta. Najverjetneje, vsaj na naši članici, je tako, da o tem razpravljamo tako na komisiji za študij, kot tudi na raznih pilotnih sestankih, kjer imamo predstavnike posameznih področij. Torej, poudarek na Univerzi v Mariboru je na vseživljenjskem učenju. To se pravi na temo gapu, kot rečejo, ki obstaja. Dodatno razprava se opravlja v okviru programskih svetov. Mi smo nedolgo nazaj imeli na naši fakulteti 3 programske svete, kjer smo se, vam bom rekel, kar 50% časa pogovarjali o vseživljenjskem učenju. Tako velik interes je strani gospodarstva. In oni prepoznavajo in si želijo, tako kot je tudi kolegica Jana že izpostavila, da na univerzi pripravimo kakovostne izobraževanja za njihove zaposlene. Že sedaj obstaja možnost, da se kdo od zaposlenih udeleži, da recimo se kot občan vpiše k izvedbi posamezne učne enote, vendar to ni isto. Tu bojo različne specifike, kot je bilo tudi že poudarjeno, želeli si bojo izobraževanja, ki bodo pisana njim na roko, lahko da bo tudi kak NDA vmes. Potem drugi sklop izobraževanj, ki se lahko pripravijo, pa so takšne z prosto prijavo. Pri teh s prosto prijavo je pa potrebno potem temeljito razmisliti, kateri sklop vsebin je tak, da bi bil ustrezen. Bilo je že izpostavljeno, in to kaže vse študije in izkušnje do sedaj, da je treba tovrstna izobraževanja prilagoditi ciljni publiki. Se pravi, če govorimo o vseživljenjskem učenju na visokošolski ravni, potem je treba se zavedati, da to so praviloma ljudje, ki so že zaposleni. Ne vsi, ampak praviloma je tako. In se je treba temu prilagoditi in specifikam, ki so s tem povezane. Zato je naše trenutno stališče po mnogih razpravah in takšno, da ni prav zares smiselno preveč mešati, ali kako naj rečem, povezovati študijskih programov in razvoja vseživljenjskega učenja. To so dve zadeve, ki se dopolnjujeta, ne. Seveda pa to ne pomeni, da se obstoječi mehanizmi, vse univerze že imamo obstoječe mehanizme, ki so vezane tudi na priznavanje, ne. In tu je treba s tresočo roko razmisliti, na kak način to narediti, ker vsota vseh učnih enot in na koncu diploma ima sinergične učinke. To ni enako, kakor da nabiraš ta znanja posamezno. To tudi prepoznavajo delodajalci, ne. Torej, mikrodokazila prepoznavamo kot vseživljenjsko učenje v prvi vrsti, smo pa definirali tudi postopke. Menimo, da moramo biti agilni pri tem, kar menim, da se vsi strinjamo. Hkrati pa, če ne želimo razvrednotiti teh pilotnih mikrodokazil in kasneje pravih mikrodokazil, že preden smo sploh zares vzpostavili ustrezno okolje, moramo velik poudarek dati na zagotavljanje kakovosti in na to zanko kakovosti, ne. Zakaj je najboljša zanka kakovosti, je še stvar razprave na nacionalni ravni. Na Univerzi v Mariboru smo v naših smernicah, naših priporočilih pripravili in definiran procesogram, na kak način to poteka, se pravi, verjamemo v to, da smo usposobljeni, da akreditiramo tovrstna krajša izobraževanja za pridobitev mikrodokazil na Univerzi v Mariboru. Uporabljali bomo podobne postopke, kot jih že uporabljamo za akreditacijo nekaterih učnih enot, ki jih izvajamo v okviru izbirnosti. Definirali smo učni načrt, obvezne in neobvezne sestavine, ki med drugim tudi vključujejo trajanje mikrodokazila. Mikrodokazila bojo zelo dinamična, zelo različna. Nekatera znanja, ki bojo pridobljena, bojo lahko recimo večna, če je kakšno znanje sploh sodi v to kategorijo, druga pa bo imela zelo jasno opredeljen čas trajanja, ne. Tako da to je specifično in tu menim, da je to potrebno pustiti fleksibilno, ker je pač to vezano glede na vsebino, ki se izvaja. Definirali smo različna učna okolja, ki jih je potrebno seveda identificirati. Na to pa poleg samega obsega, kjer smo pa sprejeli definicijo, začeli smo z definicijo. A veste, ker kljub temu, da imamo priporočila na evropski ravni, pa kljub temu, da poslušamo, prebrali smo pač vse te nacionalne standarde, ki smo jih našli iz celega sveta in ni neke potrebe, niti potem, ko razmišljaš za to, da bi bile stvari povsod enako definirane, ne. V našem kontekstu smo definirali, da je najmanjši obseg en ECTS. To se pravi, sklicujemo se na ECTS točke, ne, kot je tudi predvideno strani Evropske komisije, in smo rekli, da je najmanj en ECTS. Dodatno se mogoče malo navežem na Jano, kar je rekla, da že to ni nič novega, ne? Že sedaj smo pripravljali različna vseživljenjska učenja in absolutno se strinjam. Ni vsako vseživljenjsko učenje mikrodokazilo, ne? Mikrodokazilo torej mora biti nekaj več, ne? In kako smo mi to opredelili? Opredelili smo 3 vrste tovrstnih vseživljenjskih izobraževanj. Nekatera so izobraževanja, na katera se jih udeležiš, prisluhneš, razpravljaš, se ne preverja znanje in dobiš potrdilo, da si se udeležil. To ni mikrodokazilo, to je vseživljenjsko učenje in je prav, da je in je tudi naj ostane, ne? Ne bi bilo prav, da bi vsako stvar zdaj začeli predstavljati kot mikrodokazilo, ker drugače bomo pač izgubili fokus. Naslednja stvar je, da pripraviš tovrstno izobraževanje in da tudi preverja znanje na koncu, ne? Vendar nisi naredil postopek akreditacije. Se pravi, nisi šel čez te postopke znotraj univerze, to je še vedno vseživljenjsko učenje, ne želimo nobenega pri tem omejevati, vendar to spet ni mikrodokazilo, ne? Se pravi, pri nas trenutno, no, je mikrodokazilo samo to mikrodokazilo Univerze v Mariboru, kar se izvede akreditacijski postopek. In ta akreditacijski postopek je, da pripraviš vse priloge, teh je kar nekaj, napoveš, kako bo zadeve izvajal, to gre skozi postopek, ki pa se zaključi znotraj Univerze v Mariboru in je lahko zaključen v parih mesecih, ne, kar pomeni, da smo lahko agilni. Hkrati smo predvideli potem tudi vključitev naših učečih se v IKT infrastrukturo in tako naprej. No. To se pravi, en cel tak sistem smo nekako razdelali, vzporedno, medtem pa posamezne članice seveda v sodelovanju z delodajalci preverjajo vsebine, ki bi bilo smotrno jih pripraviti, ne. In v okviru pilotov imamo seveda to fleksibilnost tudi dopuščeno, ne, da se izvaja tako imenovana pilotna mikrodokazila, ne, kar pomeni, ne, da se lahko tudi že pred akreditacijo pilotno izvedejo, ne, in se potem na osnovi teh izkušenj zadeve nadgrajujemo. Tako da mogoče toliko iz te za uvodne besede. Predvideli smo samo evalvacijo, no, to še mogoče sam povem, kjer se zgledujemo po obstoječih postopkih, ne, in tudi zaključek izvajanja mikrodokazila in povratne informacije, o katerih pa lahko še več pa kasneje razpravljamo, ker to pa je kar izziv, kot vidimo povsod po svetu.
Dovolite mi samo še eno podvprašanje, procentualno, koliko, oziroma če ste se odločili za izvedbo online ali pa hibridnih oblik izobraževanj oziroma teh usposabljanj?
Nismo definirali in omejevali izvajalcev, to je glede na specifiko, ne? To se pravi glede na vsebino in glede na slušatelje in učeče se, ne? To se pravi glede na to se bo vsako mikrodokazilo opredelilo, v kakšni obliki bo izvedeno. Nekatera področja so zelo specifična, kjer bo potrebno drugo laboratorijske dele opraviti, ne, to se bo lahko opravilo na fakulteti ali pri mogoče celo pri delodajalcu, če ima ustrezne pogoje, ne. Mogoče, zdaj sem se spomnil samo še na eno stvar, glede sodelovanja zunanjih strokovnjakov. Izredno pomembno je z vidika kakovosti, da imamo usposobljen kader za to, ne, in obstaja že nek mehanizem, ne, kot so strokovnjaki iz prakse, ne, iz gospodarstva, ne, ki grejo skozi postopek habilitacije. Glede tega je potrebno potem sprejeti neke ustrezne odločitve, vendar to mora biti pod nadzorom, ne. Nikakor ne smemo to preveč prepustiti trgu, če želite, ne, hkrati pa je potrebno biti fleksibilen, ne, in prepoznati strokovnjaka iz prakse, ker strokovnjaka iz prakse se lahko marsikaj naučimo, seveda, ampak hkrati pa moramo skrbeti, da tisti, ki bojo tudi izvajalci, ne samo nosilci mikrodokazil, ampak tudi izvajalci, ustrezno usposobljeni. Predvideli smo tudi to, da se kot neobvezna vsebina mikrodokazila doda tudi, kdo je bil izvajalec, ne, kot zato, da se s tem še krepi ta zanka kakovosti.
Hvala lepa. Študentska organizacija. Na kakšen način ste vi sodelovali oziroma sodelujete pri oblikovanju sistema vseživljenjskega učenja oziroma teh krajših poti učnih, ki vodijo do mikrodokazil? In kakšne so vaše izkušnje? Čeprav mogoče niste primarna ciljna skupina, saj ne še zaenkrat.
Ja, lep pozdrav tudi z moje strani. Hvala za vabilo, pa hvala tudi za pripravo tega posveta. Smo študentje vedno precej veseli, če lahko sodelujemo v takih debatah, čeprav, kot ste že pravilno ugotovili, morda ne spadamo med tiste primarne koristnike tega sistema. Zdaj, koliko smo mi bili vključeni, zdaj, kot sem že povedal, bistveno vključeni nismo bili pri tej zadevi, pri pripravi smo bili deloma vključeni pri raznih delovnih skupinah na ministrstvu in pri nekih drugih institucijah, ampak da bi pa mi tukaj direktno oblikovali ta sistem, pa tega ne bi mogel trditi. Tako da ja, v bistvu mi na to gledamo, bom rekel, malo izdaljave, ne. Mnenja smo, da je pač potrebno imeti sistemsko urejeno področje, ne, centralno urejeno, ki bo poenoteno, ne bo omogočalo nekih različnih možnosti za različna tolmačenja. Tako da mi smo predvsem na mikrodokazila gledamo kot na neke dopolnitve izobraževanja, kot smo danes že večkrat povedali, pa omenili reskilling pa upskilling. v povezavi seveda s konceptom vseživljenjskega učenja. Tako da absolutno to podpiramo, kot pa sem že povedal, bo morala biti zadeva urejena nekako centralno, zato da bo tudi legitimna.
A pa vidite svojo vlogo že zdaj v sodelovanju oziroma pri oblikovanju sistema kot takega v Sloveniji?
Ja, jaz bi rekel,
in kakšna bi bila?
Ja, mislim, da smo kot deležniki ali pa neki enakovredni partnerji, za katere bi mislim, da morali biti prepoznani, da smo lahko veliko pomoč pri organizaciji tega področja. Zdaj pa v kolikšni meri bodo to želeli visokošolski zavodi ali pa ministrstvo in vsi ostali izkoristiti, pa je na njih.
Hvala. Ines Gergorič iz Gospodarske zbornice, hvala za udeležbo. Kakšna so pričakovanja gospodarstva oziroma kako naj bodo te krajše učne poti oziroma ki vodijo do mikrodokazil oblikovane, da bodo prispevale k razvoju in spodbujanju vseživljenjskega učenja in hkrati naslavljala vse te vrzeli v kompetencah, ki jih prepoznavamo tudi na evropski ravni?
Lepo pozdravljeni, hvala za povabilo in tudi organizacijo tega. Mislim, da smo slišali marsikaj. Nekaj, kar skupaj z ministrstvom delamo, in to je ugotavljanje, kaj se dejansko gospodarstvo želi, nekako utrip gospodarstva, kaj menijo o tem področju in kako oni vidijo sistem mikrodokazil v Sloveniji. Zdaj, jaz bom začela z ni slogan, ampak lahko sam rečem relevantnost, zaupanje in agilnost. To si želijo delodajalci, to si želi gospodarstvo. Zdaj, relevantnost je, kot smo danes slišali, to so tiste tematike mikrodokazil, ki so novi trendi, ki so potrebe, ker kot smo slišali, tisto, kar so univerze oziroma visokošolski zavodi delali v sodelovanju s podjetji, to že obstaja in tudi znotraj SQAA imamo področje, ki to nagovarja. To se pravi, ta del lahko ostane ali pa ne ostane, tukaj delodajalci nimajo toliko težav s tem. Izpostavili so, in tukaj mogoče še Jana pa Boštjan, ki sta to tudi nagovorila, vseživljenjsko je potrebno, ni pa vsako vseživljenjsko učenje mikrodokazilo. In tukaj je treba res narediti ločnico med tem, kdaj potrebujemo potrdilo, kdaj potrebujemo certifikat. Želijo si ga, seveda, za določena področja, ne za vse. Potem ena zadeva, kar je še, je relevantnost v smislu pridobivanja kompetenc. Na delavnicah, ki je organiziralo ministrstvo, smo se večkrat pogovarjali o tem in tukaj Boštjan tudi ve, kaj je bil takrat tudi na teh delavnicah, usmerjenost v pridobivanje kompetenc. Ne samo
Nekaj prekinja, Ines.
Recimo nekaj, kar so izpostavili. Potem, če gremo naprej, oziroma gospodarstvo ima kar, delodajalci si želijo, da bi to bilo zelo fleksibilno, kar pomeni, da bi pač tudi način izvedbe, učna okolja in tako naprej bili, kot je bilo izpostavljeno, kar je Univerza v Mariboru že povedala, to se pravi, da lahko določajo, ali bo to hibridno, ali bo online, ali bo to v živo in da se to dela glede na vsebine. Bili so zelo konkretni, naprimer, če je to manj kot 2 uri, potem je lahko online. Če je to več kot 2 uri, potem se splača priti tudi v živo, seveda glede na samo vsebino. Potem imamo recimo ene zadeve, ki se nanašajo, oziroma ene ideje, ki so jih imeli delodajalci v tem smislu, da bi praktični del, da bi lahko ločili na neke splošne vsebine, neko pridobivanje nekega pregleda in tistega praktičnega pridobivanja kompetence, da bi to lahko bilo v sodelovanju ali pa z evropskimi akademijami ali pa z demopilotnimi centri. To se pravi, da se deležniki tega ekosistema še bolje povežejo. To so recimo bile nekatere izmed njihovih predlogov, ki jih do zdaj mogoče nismo titno slišali od visokošolskih zavodov, ki so pogovarjali z njimi. Gospodarstvo si tudi želi zelo, in tukaj naslavljamo zdaj spet sistem kakovosti, želijo si zaupanja v ta certifikat, kar pomeni, da so to akreditacije, da je to cel sistem nastavljen, da vemo, kaj bomo dobili, da je to enotno po celi Sloveniji, vsaj tisto, kar imamo mi tu. Seveda pač, kot je rekla Duša, je to globalna zadeva in se je treba zavedati, da smo pol vsi nekako oziroma vsi ponudniki mikrodokazil tudi na trgu. Zdaj, kar se pa tiče teh habilitacij oziroma zunanjih predstavnikov, ki bi izvajali mikrodokazila skupaj v sodelovanju z visokošolskimi zavodi, tukaj so mnenja, da tisti, ki so zelo priznani strokovnjaki, mednarodno priznani, ki so eksperti na svojem področju, da bi jim moglo biti dovoljeno tudi z nekim lažjim postopkom habilitacije oziroma bolj prožnim, dovoliti, da bi to tudi izvajali. Hkrati se zavedajo, da je tukaj zelo, mislim, da je na trgu ogromno vsega, kot je Jana rekla, ponudnikov teh izobraževanj, vseživljenjskih izobraževanj je ogromno. To se pravi, imamo veliko možnosti in potem dostikrat tudi sami presojamo, ali smo bili zadovoljni ali ne. Zato so predlagali tudi, da bi bil feedback, recimo povratna informacija po izvedbi strani delodajalca in strani inštitucije, narejena s tem, da bi delodajalca po nekaj mestih lahko vprašali, kako pa kaj. Potem, če govorimo o agilnosti, tukaj je recimo, ko pride nek nov trend, vzela bom primer ChatGPT-ja, ker smo vsi seznanjeni s tem, pa to je bilo res splošno za vsakega recimo relevantno. Tukaj v mestih po neki novi tehnologiji, nekem novem trendu dostopno mikrodokazilo. Kar pomeni, da je tukaj treba okrepiti to sodelovanje oziroma prenos potreb gospodarstva. Zdaj govorim samo o tem gospodarstvenem delu, zaradi tega, ker se zavedamo, da je tudi potreba teh družbenih nekih potreb. To bo nenehno, verjetno v sodelovanju z visokošolskimi zavodi dostopno. Kar se pa tiče gospodarstva, da bi se jih bolj vključilo tudi v prenos teh potreb, v ažuriranju teh potreb, zato da imajo dostop do mikrodokazil, ki so relevantna za njih zelo hitro, potem ko nekaj pride na vrsto. Zdaj pogovarjamo se tukaj o zelenem prehodu, o digitalizaciji, zelenem prehodu, industriji 5.0. Ampak hkrati so omenjali tudi vsebine, ki niso vezane toliko na tehnologijo. Omenjali so vsebine, ki se tičejo pridobivanja nekih power skillsov, kar pomeni, da te soft variante so tudi pomembne in tukaj je bilo ta feedback oziroma ta povratna informacija delodajalcev, zelo pomembna čez nekaj mesecev, ali je oseba dejansko dosegla ta rezultat mikrodokazila, ta cilj mikrodokazila, ali je razvila te kompetence, kar se vidi v spremembi vedenja pri tem zaposlenem, kar se vidi v spremembi oziroma v doseganju nekih rezultatov, ciljev, ki si jih je zastavila organizacija, kar pomeni, da tukaj bomo mogli veliko nekih pogovorov imeti oziroma povezovanja tako šolskih zavodov in gospodarstva, da se te stvari nekako dorečejo. Menim, da so stvari, kot so bile predstavljene, še zelo odprte. Strinjajo se recimo s tistimi predlogi, ki so bili, da bi ECTS točke bile od 1 pa do recimo tam nekje 20-30, ne več, zaradi tega, ker bi to pomenilo preveč obsega udeleževanja njihovih zaposlenih in tudi, da ta izobraževanja ne bi bila izpostavljena oziroma ne bi bila izvedena v zelo kratkem strnjenem času izvajanja, recimo v enem tednu, pa vse skupaj, ampak da bi trajalo nekaj časa, da bi imeli priložnost imeti naloge, projekte, tudi kakšne seminarske ali pa neko dokazovanje pridobivanja kompetenc na drugačen način, vendar da to ne bi trajalo dlje kot 2-3 meseca, vse skupaj zaradi tega, ker se potem znanje tudi razvodeni oziroma je težje slediti temu, vsaj kar se tiče zaposlenih. Potem smo imeli, če gremo spet zelo konkretno za izvajanje oziroma kdaj nameniti pogovarjanje za zaposlene, upskilling, reskilling in tako naprej, da je pomembno, da je to ali pa v delovnem času ali pa delno v delovnem času, delno v zasebnem času zaposlenega. Tako da bi bila neka kombinacija, seveda pa ne ob vikendih ali pa da res zajeda v čas zaposlenega. Tu so recimo neke take, jaz sem šla bolj na konkretne ravni, pa menim, da tudi univerzam to mogoče zdaj prav pride za izboljšanje njihovih že vzpostavljenih sistemov, ki jih imajo, tako da mogoče tudi za sistem kakovosti, da si res edina stvar, ki so izpostavili, da mora biti zaupanje, mora biti ta trust, da lahko v bistvu mikrodokazila sploh zaživijo, če ne bo verjetno isto kot vsa ostala izobraževanja, ki so do sedaj že na trgu. Pa mogoče
hvala lepa za zelo pomembne poudarke. Tudi kar se tiče samega sistema kakovosti, ker ravno spremljanje teh učinkov na koncu, ne samo dodeljevanje nekih certifikatov ali kakorkoli se bo imenovalo že to mikrodokazilo, je izredno pomembno za dolgoživost takih mikrodokazil. Ja, prosim, Boštjan, izvolite.
Ja, hvala lepa. Mogoče pa kratke replike zelo. Kar se tiče akreditacije, jaz sem zelo vesel, da slišim tovrstna sporočila tudi strani gospodarstva in me ne preseneča. Se pravi, mi smo vsi akreditirani visokošolski zavodi. Se pravi, za akreditirane visokošolske zavode, ki so tudi podvrženi zunanji evalvaciji, menimo na Univerzi v Mariboru, da smo usposobljeni, da izvedemo akreditacijske postopke, pa tudi samo evalvacije in evalvacijske postopke sami za tovrstne oblike izobraževanj. Seveda pa je pravilno, da potem ob zunanji evalvaciji inštitucije se ti postopki preverijo strani strokovnjakov in strani NAKVIS-a, zato da se zagotavlja ta kakovost. NAKVIS je vpet v vse mednarodne povezave, vsi ti postopki so standardizirani, kar pomeni, da ta način akreditacije ne more metati niti kančka sence dvoma v kakovost, tudi ko govorimo o priznavanju mikrodokazil v Evropi in širše. Tako da menim, da je ta sistem že vzpostavljen in da ga lahko lepo s pridom uporabimo. Veseli me, da gospodarstvo tudi prepoznava, da gre to dejansko za krajša izobraževanja. Se pravi, slišali smo danes govorce, da ponekod to obravnavajo kot krajše študijske programe. Zdaj, treba je razumeti, da v različnih kontekstih, v različnih državah, v različnih kulturah se stvari malo drugače poimenujejo. Dostikrat na mednarodnih sestankih si moramo narediti prav slovarček, zato da ne govorimo, uporabljamo istih terminov, pa mislimo druge stvari. Tako da jaz ne bi govoril o študijskih programih v kontekstu mikrodokazil. Pa čeprav govorimo o krajših izobraževanjih, ki se lahko načeloma tudi združujejo in tako naprej, to ni problematično, sam ne bi pa dal to v isto kategorijo. Imamo že po trenutni zakonodaji, tudi kot je bilo lepo predtem že izpostavljeno, možnost tudi akreditirati krajše študijske programe. Po zakonu od 10 ECTS navzgor, čeprav je 60 nek uveljavljen standard, v Sloveniji se pravi 1 leto za tovrstne zadeve, kjer ne pridobiš nove izobrazbe. In podobno po mikrodokazilih ne sme biti naš cilj, da nekdo pridobi novo izobrazbo, ampak da pridobi kompetence, kot je bilo izpostavljeno. Tako da jaz mislim, kar se tiče te akreditacije, jaz menim, da bi tovrstni pristop bil ustrezen. Povratna informacija strani delodajalca je ključna. Mi smo to vključili tudi v svoje postopke. Moramo pa na nivoju države zagotoviti nek sistem, da nam bo to omogočil spremljati. Zdaj vsi vemo, da to ni tako preprosto, na kak način to narediti. Zdaj, ali želimo iti po istem postopku, kot so hoteli pa restauracije, pa potem zatem, ko si bil v restauraciji, ti pošljajo mail, da boš dobil popuščje in boš dal 5 zvezdic, ne vem. Tu bomo morali malo razmisliti, a je to nekaj, kar si želimo ali ne, ali bomo to znali na nek način interpretirati pa filtrirati. Absolutno pa potrebujemo povratno informacijo. Posod po svetu imajo težave s to povratno informacijo. Ponekod se priklapljajo na davčne podatke. To se pravi, da preverjajo, ali se je prispevek davkov posameznika, ki se je udeležil mikrodokazil, povečal in s tem posredno sklepajo, da je imel vpliv. Zdaj, kaj lahko mi v okviru naših zakonskih zmožnosti lahko naredimo, je treba preveriti. Vemo, da je to izziv. Tudi že z vidika študijskih programov, ko probamo pridobivati povratne informacije, še najboljše pridobimo z neposrednim pogovorom z delodajalci. Bi bilo pa super imeti en nacionalni pristop. Mogoče, kar se tiče Univerze v Mariboru, pripravlja tudi en izmed pilotnih projektov, je enotna vstopna točka za gospodarstvo. V okviru drugega pripravljamo pa tudi katalog vseživljenjskih izobraževanj. Na ta način bi naslovili to, kar je Ines izpostavila, da si gospodarstvo želi. Seveda pa ne gre iz danes na jutri in se ne želimo preveč hiteti. To se pravi, želimo te postopke zdaj v okviru pilotov preveriti, testirati in tudi iz članic bomo dobili povratne informacije za posamezna specifična področja in med drugim gotovo so izredno pomembne prečne kompetence. To so kompetence, ki jih seveda delodajalci prepoznavajo kot ključne, in to je, kot je tudi Andrej povedal, ne, strani študentov, se nadejam v veliki meri prepoznano kot nekaj potrebnega kot dopolnitev rednih študijskih programov, ki seveda so predvsem strokovno fokusirani, seveda preko različnih aktivnosti dobijo tudi prečne kompetence, ne, vendar so te prečne kompetence potem kasneje v življenju ključne. Toliko samo na hitro na to, kar je bilo izpostavljeno.
Ja, se nam že počasi zmanjkuje časa, mogoče samo še jaz kratko povzamem, preden dam še besedo kolegici iz Univerze v Ljubljani. In sicer mi smo že nekaj časa na stališču, ko smo razmišljali, na kakšen način vključevati mikrodokazila oziroma sistem v zunanji sistem kakovosti. Seveda smo se odločili, da vsaj za enkrat ne kaže tako, da bi bili podvrženi nekim akreditacijskim postopkom, ampak bi se spremljala kakovost sistema vpeljanga na institucionalni ravni, seveda v postopkih podaljšanja, eventualno, vkolikor bi se izkazala potreba in vkolikor bi rezultati projektov to pokazali, tudi na ravni samoevaluacije posameznih študijskih programov, če bi bili seveda vključeni v to razčlenitev oziroma unbundling, kot temu rečemo. Pomembno je tudi mogoče poudariti, da zdaj vidim tudi spremljam vprašanja, ki ste jih udeleženci naslovili znotraj Q&A. Na vsa vprašanja, ki se tičejo same strukture, vsebine, kakšno trajanje naj bi bilo teh mikrodokazil, načini, metode raznega usposabljanja oziroma poučevanja, spremljanja, seveda verjetno bo naslavljal to vodnik po mikrodokazilih. Duša, verjetno mi lahko potrdiš. In ta dokument, predvidevam, bo usklajen z vsemi visokošolskimi deležniki. Tukaj sicer v tem omizju, v tej panelni razpravi imamo udeležence iz javnih univerz, ki sodelujejo v prej omenjenem projektu, ampak seveda gre za sistem, ki se uvaja na ravni celotne Republike Slovenije, ne samo v javnem sektorju. Tako da pa na tej točki jaz zaključim in predajam besedo še Jani Arbajter, prosim.
Najlepša hvala. Jaz bi se navezala na to, kar je kolega Boštjan omenjal, kar se mi zdi izjemno pomembno, da poudarimo, vsaj strani Univerze v Ljubljani. Torej, mi mikrodokazil v nobenem primeru ne razumemo kot nek nadomestek študijskih programov ali pa način pridobivanja, lažji način pridobivanja diplom. Vsekakor pa vidimo to kot pomemben del tudi za študente. Morda smo naredili danes krivico, ker jih nismo omenili, ampak pri nas na univerzi kar nekaj usposabljanj namenjenih izključno študentom, ne bodo za podjetja, ampak to vidimo kot neko krepitev njihovih kompetenc in dodatek že k obstoječemu znanju. Morda bi bilo za razmisliti, ali je to nek dodatek k diplomam na koncu, kjer so te kompetence navedene, ker sem mnenja, da bodo delodajalci zagotovo te stvari spremljali, pogledali in bodo dajali študentom, ki bodo pokazali neko samoiniciativnost, željo, da se dodatno izobražujejo, tudi neko konkurenčno prednost na samem trgu. In vsekakor nismo pozabili na študente in v testnih izvedbah bodo študenti tudi vključeni, tako da res mogoče opravičilo študentske organizacije, ker smo pozabili omeniti študente, ampak ne, nismo pozabili na vas. Je pa res, da je večji del seveda teh usposabljanj namenjen gospodarstvu oziroma, bom rekla, podjetjem oziroma že zaposlenim osebam. Ampak res bi poudarila, mikrodokazila ne morejo nadomeščati pridobivanja diplom, magisterijev ali kakršnekoli uradne izobrazbe, ampak so dodatek k obstoječim študijskim programom in tudi zaradi tega, in se absolutno strinjam, sami na univerzi bomo imeli postopek evalvacije. Pri nas vidim, da smo vse tri univerze tukaj danes prisotne zelo na podoben način razmišljali in postavili podoben interni sistem, interno presojo, potrjevanje učnih programov, evalvacijo na koncu in vse te zadeve, ker se zavedamo, da je pomembno na koncu vsekakor preveriti kakovost tudi samega izvedenega programa, ki ga ponudimo na trgu. Lahko imamo, zavedamo se, lahko imamo na papirju odlične strokovnjake in odlične predavatelje, pa mogoče samo usposabljanje še vedno ne bo tako odlično, zato pa rabimo stalno preverjanje, stalno evalvacijo, komunikacijo z udeleženci, izvajalci in pa tudi naročniki na koncu koncev, drugače ne bomo mogli zagotavljati neke visoke kakovosti in dobrih usposabljanj. Kar bi pa na tem mestu še dodala, kar se nam kaže na univerzi, mi smo opravili kar nekaj pogovorov s podjetji, pa tudi kar nekaj anket smo z njimi opravili, ne, in oni ves čas poudarjajo, morda tukaj dodam k temu, kar je Ines povedala, še našo izkušnjo, da se jim zdi pomembno oblikovati usposabljanje z mikrodokazili, tudi zato, ker podjetje samo pridobiva na konkurenčnosti, ko vlaga v svoje kadre z usposabljanji, ne, ko posamezniki pridobivajo dodatna znanja, dodatne kompetence, ti posamezniki potem, vsaj po naših ugotovitvah, raje ostajajo v teh podjetjih, prispevajo k rasti podjetja in tako naprej. Naša izkušnja pa je, in to je tudi naše interno, bom rekla, naše interne smernice, mi smo se odločili, da preizkusimo obseg mikrodokazil med 0,5 ECTS in pa 9 ECTS, ker se je izkazalo, da podjetja so v bistvu zelo naklonjena med 4 do 8 urnim usposabljanjem, seveda je pa to odvisno od teme, ki jo naslavljamo in seveda kompetenc, ki jih želimo nasloviti. Recimo izkušnja če rečem zelo splošno, v trajnostnem razvoju, ne, ker to je zdaj zelo popularno še vedno in si podjetja želijo znanja na tem področju, želijo kratka usposabljanja z osnovnimi kompetencami, medtem ko pa imamo primer velikega podjetja, ki želi ogromno usposabljanja, govorimo pa o daljših obsegih. Tako da je tukaj ta fleksibilnost izjemnega pomena, kot smo že v bistvu pravzaprav vsi kar nekajkrat omenili. Hvala.
Hvala lepa. Še Duša mogoče? Komentar na vprašanje v chatu oziroma v Q&A?
Q&A pa na tvoj izziv, ko si vprašal, kako bo ministrstvo pripravilo vseobsegajoč vodnik, priročnik. Mi vidimo, da je naloga ministrstva res to, kar tudi priporočila sveta EU pravijo, skrbeti za vzpostavitev ekosistema za mikrodokazila. In Sloveniji to pomeni umestitev mikrodokazil v slovensko visoko šolstvo. Tako da to bo poudarek do konca leta, ker moramo tudi kot Slovenija poročati Evropski komisiji, izdati časovnico, kako bomo uvedli mikrodokazila v celotno izobraževalno vertikalo. Mi se danes pogovarjamo o visokem šolstvu in tukaj se vidi, da je mednarodno res narejen največji premislek, tako da države tukaj vzporedno delamo. Zakaj delamo trenutno z javnimi visokošolskimi zavodi? Zato, ker smo v okviru načrta za okrevanje in odpornost lahko zagotovili sredstva tudi za mikrodokazila. Tako da ta vodnik, priročnik bomo v prvi fazi preverjali z izvajalci pilotnih projektov, potem ga bomo pa tudi javno predstavili, takole, kot se je že izkazalo večkrat, da je dober forum online ali v živo, bomo videli v prihodnjem letu. Tako v okviru kohezijske politike pa potem že pričakujemo oziroma planiramo naslednji paket spodbujanja priprave mikrodokazil in sodelovanja z gospodarstvom, ki bo pa dostopno vsem visokošolskim zavodom. Ampak da lahko začnemo izvajati, pa res rabimo nacionalni okvir izvajanja mikrodokazil in se moramo tudi dogovoriti, kako jih bomo umestili v sistem kakovosti. Hvala.
Hvala. Mogoče sam še en zadnji komentar, preden se zahvalim in predam besedo predsedniku sveta. Verjetno, tako kar je bilo že omenjeno, Ines je omenila, da nujno potrebujemo nek vsesplošen oziroma nacionalen sistem ali pa pregled tovrstnih ponujenih teh kratkih izobraževanj, ki vodijo do mikrodokazil, kot nek katalog oziroma nek register teh mikrodokazil, ker konec koncev, ker bi izkazovali tudi določeno kakovost, bi dajali neko preglednost in hkrati omogočali tudi primerljivost, prenosljivost konec koncev teh sistemov oziroma teh kvalifikacij mikrodokazil in verjetno bo govora tudi o tem, ko se bo govorilo o vodniku.
Ja, na kratko je, ja.
Na kratko.
Vse takoj dam besedo predsedniku. Ampak dejansko je tako, določene podatke bo treba voditi na nacionalni ravni, zato je predviden IVŠ in ena od naših nalog, tudi da v najkrajšem času definiramo te osnovne elemente za vpis mikrodokazila, prav strukturo kako jih bodo morali voditi visokošolski zavodi, da bo potem to mednarodno primerljivo. In tukaj sodelujemo tudi z Evropsko komisijo, zato da zagotovimo primerljivo znotraj EU-ja.
Jaz bi se rad zahvalil vsem za vaše prispevke, zelo zanimive podatke, vaše razmišljanja. Verjamem, da to ni zadnja, ampak kvečem ena od začetnih točk razprave uveljavljanja mikrodokazil v Republiki Sloveniji, in s tem zaključujem ta del in predajam besedo predsedniku sveta, dr. Borisu Dularju, za zaključne besede. Hvala lepa.
Hvala lepa vsem. Verjetno se vsi udeleženci današnjega mednarodnega posveta strinjate s tem, da je bilo v bistvu tema oblikovanja sistema kakovosti mikrodokazil prava tema za današnjo razpravo. Zdi se mi, da smo v tem uvodnem delu mednarodnih primerjav in seveda elementov, ki so na tem področju zanimiva, v bistvu videli, bi rekel, to raznolikost pristopov, od tega, da se nekje vse začne, pa pol ugotovimo, da pravzaprav bi fino imeli tudi sistem. Moram reči, da sem pa zelo bil v bistvu pozitivno navdušen pravzaprav tem, da v predstavitvah danes v panelu je dejansko viden ta dinamičen odziv visokega šolstva na ta mikrodokazila. Ne z vidika forme, ampak pravega pristopa za to, da se zadeve nadgradijo, da postanejo življenjska za potrebe vseživljenjskega učenja. In to, kar je bilo, se mi zdi zelo jasno poudarjeno, mikrodokazila so del vseživljenjskega učenja, ne pa, da so pravzaprav samo to. In ne bi seveda zdaj elaboriral zaključkov, ker to ni bil namen, ampak zdi se mi pomembno to, kar je gospa Marjetičeva opozorila, to aktivnosti, ki jih morajo opraviti vsa tri ministrstva skupaj, da se zadeve res postavijo, umestijo in da se, kar je bilo poudarjeno, dejansko oblikuje ta nacionalni okvir vezan na mikrodokazila in ti minimalni standardi, ki morajo biti. Torej, meni se zdi, da je torej ta dinamičnost in fleksibilnost tista, ki zadeva, ki v bistvu definira kakovost vključevanja in izvajanja pravzaprav tega procesa, in da pravzaprav v dnevnem, vsakodnevnem življenju, še posebej je to, kar je bilo danes tudi opozorjeno, vezano na gospodarstvo, še posebej pomembno. Torej, mi imamo potrebo po fleksibilnem in hitrem, ne da bomo se oblikovanju sistema posvetili ene 2 leti, vmes smo pa že marsikaj izgubili. In zdi se mi, da današnja razprava pokazala na odločno pripravljenost in delovanje v tej smeri, brez nepotrebnih formalizacij. Ob jasnem zadevanju, ker ste ga vsi zelo opozorili, mi pa vendarle kakovosti, celovito kakovosti in po tem področju dajemo enak poudarek kot sicer v celotnem sistemu visokega šolstva. Še enkrat res iskrena hvala vsem predavateljem in udeležencem na panelu in seveda tudi udeležencem. Željo, da ta proces, ki je jasno definiran, tudi nadaljujemo, in predvsem se mi zdi, da je zaključek pomemben ta, da ko se proces financiranja zaključi, zadeva živi in je kakovostna v delovanju sistema visokega šolstva. Hvala lepa in nasvidenje.
Hvala, srečno, nasvidenje.